You're watching Noir Street. I'm your host, Nero Wolfe. Every story hides a secret, and every shadow hides a clue. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. Subscribe, tap the like button, and join us as we drift into mystery. Chapter 1. The chair with no name rain washed the city clean, but not honest. New York in a wet April has a way of looking as if it has just come from confession and expects credit for it. The gutters ran hard, the taxi roofs gleamed, and the brown fronts along the side streets wore that dark polish which only rain can give old stone. Archie Goodwin, who had not asked to be in a taxi crossing town at 7:30 in the evening in a dinner jacket that pinched him at the shoulder blades, was not in a charitable frame of mind. The cab nosed east, then north again, and finally turned through iron gates into the half-circle drive of Ashcroft House, which stood on its lot as if zoning laws had been invented for smaller people. It was one of those private city mansions left over from a period when men with $30 million had thought they needed 6 stories, and a ballroom merely to prove they were not grocers. The rain had slicked the limestone front and blackened the steps, and the lamps at the entrance gave off a yellow light that made the place look warm and rich, and not in the least like the setting for murder. That came later. I paid the driver and went up under the port. Cushier handed my hat to a footman, who looked as if he had been assembled by a specialist in disapproval, and gave my name to another. He examined my card without enthusiasm, and then bowed me into a drawing room large enough to stable horses. I was there because Nero Wolfe was not. That was not rare. Wolfe preferred staying on West 35th Street to almost any other activity that did not involve orchids, books, beer, or food. When attendance elsewhere became unavoidable, I usually did it for him, and if he did not care enough to attend himself, that did not mean he did not care at all. Gideon Vale had written Wolfe a letter on thick paper with a discreet crest, requesting advice on a private matter involving household circumstances and a question of personal danger. He had added that he could not come downtown, would not discuss it by telephone, and would appreciate Wolfe's representative joining a small dinner that evening. Since men who use phrases like household circumstances are either bores or trouble magnets, and since the enclosed check had been good, Wolfe had told me to go. "Observe," he had said. "When I have finished observing, come back and report, preferably with a minimum of embellishment." That hurts me, coming from a man who owns 10,000 orchids. He had shut his eyes, which was dismissal. So there I was. The drawing room held 6 people, all with drinks and all wearing that polished expression used by persons who have money and are trying not to show they know it. A white-haired woman in black, satin occupied the center as if she had been issued with the furniture. A broad fellow with a cavalry mustache stood near the mantel. A younger man with a trim dark beard was by the window. A woman in silver stood too straight near a lamp, and 2 other males had arranged themselves as if by treaty to avoid one another. A servant murmured my name. Heads turned. The white-haired woman gave me a look that managed to ask who had permitted me and answer that no one of importance had. "Mr. Goodwin. Mr. Vale is detained for a moment. I am his sister, Miss Honora Vale." I bowed the amount required by civilization, but no more. "Mr. Vale asked me to attend in Mr. Wolfe's place." "Yes." My brother mentioned that possibility. Her voice was dry enough to preserve flowers. "You are a detective, when I can get decent pay for it." That did not improve matters. I was introduced around. The cavalry item was Colonel Branshaw, retired from something loud. The woman in silver was Mrs. Lydia Tarrant, widow of a shipping man and friend of the family. The bearded male was Julian Kelm, Vale's secretary. The other 2 were Peter Vale, the host's nephew, and Dr. Adrian Sloane, a physician with a handsome face and eyes that had spent too much time learning patience. I filed them and took a glass of sherry from a tray. No one seemed happy, since they were gathered for a formal dinner in a house built to make formality feel at home. That by itself meant little, but there was more. Conversation came in short pieces. People kept listening inward. I moved toward Kelm, because secretaries often know where the bones are buried, even if they did not choose the cemetery. "Mr. Vale expecting anyone else?" His eyes flicked to me and away. One or two? Anion in particular? That depends what you mean by particular. That's a neat answer. It has served me. He sipped his drink. Mr. Vale liked to control his evenings. Past tense. He looked at me then, and if he regretted it, he was too quick to show it. A manner of speaking. Before I could stir that, a servant announced dinner. The dining room at Ashcroft House had portraits, silver, crystal, candles, and enough old mahogany to keep 3 antique dealers solvent. There were 10 places set. 9 of us went in. The 10th was empty until the last instant. We were standing behind our chairs while a butler conducted the ritual, and I had just located my card when a man entered by the side door as if he had taken a wrong turn 20 years ago and been wandering the corridors ever since. He was thin, medium height, somewhere in his 40s, with a face that had been neglected by vanity and improved by it. His suit was correct, but indifferent, his dark hair damp at the temples, and he carried no overcoat. If he was a family intimate, he wore it oddly. If he was an intruder, he showed no nerves. The butler froze. That was interesting. The stranger glanced once around the table, then moved, not hesitating, and put his hand on the back of the one chair in the room that had no card before it. He did not sit yet. He looked toward the doorway. Gideon Vale entered. He was a large man, not fat, but constructed on a scale that suggested he disliked being contradicted by furniture. He had a full, square face, iron-grey hair, and those pale, steady eyes you see in men who have been obeyed for 40 years and would take it as a personal affront if the sun failed to rise. His evening clothes fitted him like intention. For 1 second he stopped. No one in the room breathed. I don't mean that poetically. I mean 9 throats closed. Miss Honora's fingers tightened on the chair before her. Colonel Brunshaw's moustache twitched. Mrs. Tarrant stared. Kelm went a shade lighter. Peter Vale half turned as if to speak, then thought better of it. Dr. Sloane's gaze moved from the stranger to Gideon Vale and held there. The stranger sat down. No one told him not to. That was the first important fact of the evening. Gideon Vale resumed motion, went to the head of the table and said, "Let us sit." It was done. Chairs moved. Napkins opened. The servants, who had been as still as engravings, revived and began the first course. If you had come in 3 minutes later, you might have thought it an ordinary dinner, except that you would have been wrong. I was placed midway down the table with Mrs. Tarrant on my right and Peter Vale opposite. The stranger sat 3 places from Gideon on the left, in the chair that had received the silence. A card had somehow appeared before him, face down. He did not touch it. Gideon Vale said, "Mr. Goodwin attends on behalf of Nero Wolfe." The stranger inclined his head in my direction, as if that accounted for me. I gave him the same back. Gideon continued. Mr. Reed joined us at my invitation. No one challenged it. That was the second important fact. Dinner moved, turtle soup, sole in white wine, a saddle of lamb that might have caused Wolfe to grunt approval despite the company. Conversation was produced and consumed in measured amounts, but it never warmed. Gideon directed it with the efficiency of a man moving pieces on a board while keeping one square under watch. I took my share. Archie Goodwin in society can do enough damage to justify his dinner. Mrs. Tarrant wanted to know whether detectives were as cynical as novelists described them. I told her some were duller. Peter Vale asked whether Wolfe truly refused to leave his house. I said only under the strongest provocation, such as taxes or murder. Even Miss Honora let one dry remark fall regarding professional observers. But all that was smoke. The fire was at the far end of the table, where Elias Reed sat in the wrong chair and spoke little. When spoken to, he answered plainly, neither deferential nor aggressive. He had a low voice and a habit of considering a question the way a man might test ice before stepping on it. He said he had lately returned from Boston. He knew Gideon Vale from some years ago. He declined wine after the first glass. Once, while the butler served the lamb, I saw Reed's fingers touch the edge of his plate and saw the butler nearly miss a step. I watched Gideon Vale watching Reed. You learn things at tables if you keep your own mouth from using all your available time. Gideon never directly looked at the stranger for more than a second. The others did not know where to look at all. Only Dr. Sloane seemed to forget performance now and then. Twice I caught him studying Miss Honora, and once the empty rhythm around Reed's chair, with a look that was less surprise than old dread. Midway through the lamb course, Peter Vale made the mistake that younger men make when tension gets above their ceiling. "Uncle Gideon," he said, "since all the world appears to be represented, perhaps you'll tell us why the house has been acting like a mausoleum for a week." Miss Honora said sharply, "Peter." "No, let him," Gideon said. Peter set down his fork. He was in his early 30s, handsome enough to get away with too much, and not old enough to know when the bill would come due. "You asked us here. You ask a detective. You bring in." He checked himself and glanced at Reed. "A guest, no one expected. I should think a little plainness wouldn't kill us." That turned out to be an unfortunate word choice. Gideon wiped his mouth. Plainness is often overrated. However, since melodrama seems to be requested, I have recently received several communications of a threatening nature. No one moved except Kelm, who moved too little. Mrs. Tarrant breathed. Threatening. Anonymous, petty in style, tiresome in content. I would have ignored them except that one of them referred to a private family detail of considerable antiquity. Miss Honora said. "Gideon," he raised a finger and she stopped. Peter leaned forward. "What detail?" Gideon looked at him. "One that does not concern you." Peter flushed. Colonel Branshaw rumbled blackmail, an inept attempt at intimidation. Gideon said, "Nothing more. Mr. Goodwin is here because I considered consulting Wolfe." "And Mr. Reed?" Dr. Sloane asked. That was the first direct thrust made all evening. Sloane's voice was easy, but his eyes were not. Gideon turned his head. "Mr. Reed is here because I invited him." "Yes," Sloane said. That was clear. Reed put down his fork. "I am sorry if my presence embarrasses anyone." Miss Honora gave a short laugh with no pleasure in it. Embarrassment is not the word. Reed looked at her. Not defending himself. Perhaps not. Gideon's tone hardened. And there it was again. Silence, but thicker. The rest of dinner survived through custom and servitude. There was salad, then pheasant, then a pudding that deserved more attention than it got. Coffee was announced in the drawing room, but Gideon said no. He preferred it served in the study. He asked Miss Honora, Colonel Branshaw, and Dr. Sloane to join him there after the ladies withdrew. Then, after the briefest pause, he added, "Mr. Reed also." That gave me a new fact and no explanation. If the wrong chair had been a signal, the study invitation was another. The ladies rose, men got to their feet, chairs moved back. As we were drifting out, I found myself beside the butler, a long, solemn relic named Partridge. "You nearly dropped the lamb," I said softly. His eyes stayed ahead. "No, sir." Then your hand twitched. "I cannot imagine what gave you that impression, sir. Maybe your hand." He did not answer. A top butler can preserve more information in silence than a district attorney can get with a subpoena. In the drawing room, the women arranged themselves for after-dinner conversation. I had no invitation to the study, and Gideon did not include me. Since I had been sent to observe, not to insist, I stayed where I was and accepted coffee. Peter Vale prowled. Kelm stood by the mantel with the air of a man who had swallowed a memorandum and could not digest it. I went to him. "Who is Reed?" He glanced toward the open door. "A guest. You're slipping," he almost smiled. "On the contrary, Mr. Goodwin, I am choosing my footing." Did Vale expect him? Yes. That chair he took. Why did the servants look sick? Kelm's fingers tightened on the coffee cup. "Old houses have old habits. Old habits don't blanch a butler," he said. "Ashcroft House has traditions. Then that chair is part of one." He looked at me. "You are observant. That's what the fee covers." He started to say something more, but Peter Vale joined us with the restless energy of a man who has had too much family and not enough freedom. "You're Wolfe's man," he said. "Well, are you observing?" "I'm earning the right to invoice." "Then observe this. My uncle has been impossible. For days he has shut himself in, sent odd notes, called in that fellow Reed from nowhere, and now sits in the study with him and won't tell anyone why. Does Reed know something? Peter laughed once. Apparently he knows where to sit. That was useful, because it came from the nephew. Not me, Miss Honora called Peter sharply from across the room. He ignored it. That chair, he said in a lower tone, belongs to no guest. Belongs to whom? His mouth thinned. My father. That landed. Your father is dead. For 23 years, and the chair is left empty at family dinners. He gave a quick nod. Always, it was my grandfather's rule after my father died. My uncle kept it. No one sits there, except Reed. Yes, why? Peter looked toward the hall. That, he said, is what I would dearly like to know. Before I could ask the next question, a sound came from somewhere beyond the drawing room. Not a scream, not a crash big enough for theater, just a hard, blunt noise, like a chair leg striking wood, followed by a woman's gasp from the hall. Everyone froze for a fraction, then moved at once. We reached the study door in a bunch and stalled because a servant had stopped short in the opening with a tray in his hands. I got past him first, because that is one advantage of not being a gentleman. Gideon Vale was at his desk, or rather against it, and half off it. His body had slid sideways in the big leather chair, one arm hanging, the head tilted at a wrong angle that no doctor needs explained. A dark stain spread across the white shirt front, just left of the center. The desk lamp made it black. Red, Miss Honora, gave one choking sound and stopped. Mrs. Tarrant clutched the door frame. Colonel Branshaw swore under his breath. Dr. Sloane was already moving, faster than the others. Reed was nowhere in sight. That was the third important fact, and it was the one that made the evening officially bad. Sloane bent, pressed fingers to Gideon's throat, then looked up. He's dead. No one disputed him. There was no point. The study smelled of leather, tobacco, coffee, and the copper taint that arrives early. Papers lay on the desk in tidy stacks, except for one sheet near Gideon's right hand, skewed as if recently moved. A coffee cup on a side table had spilled. The French doors to the terrace were shut. Rain ticked against the glass. There was another door at the back, partly open, leading to a smaller library. I took it in without stepping farther than necessary. If Wolfe had been there, he would have told me later that I had missed 3 things and invented 2. Since he wasn't, I did what I could. Did anyone see Reed leave? I asked. No answer. Peter Vale burst out. Where the devil is he? Colonel Branshaw said, Find him. Partridge had appeared behind us, pale but erect. Gideon Vale, dead 10 feet away, could not make him slouch. I have sent James to lock the front entrance, sir. Good, I said. And someone call the police. Miss Honora turned to me with blazing eyes. Must that be done at once? I stared at her. No, let's wait until breakfast. She stiffened and looked away. That told me something too, though not enough yet to name it. Dr. Sloane stood up from the body. No one should touch anything. Agreed, I said, except that if Reed is still in the house, I'd rather know before he goes out with the umbrellas. Kelm spoke for the first time since we reached the study. He may have gone through the back corridor. Then let's cover it. Peter had already started. I went with him because nephews with hot blood are poor searchers and good witnesses only when kept alive. We crossed the rear library, pushed through a service passage, and found nothing but startled servants and polished floors. Rain drummed on the windows. The side entrance was bolted. The kitchen staff gaped. No Elias Reed back at the study the household had collected in layers, like sediment around disaster. Partridge had got through to the police. Miss Honora had seated herself, but not, I thought, because she was weak, because she wished to appear not weak. Mrs. Tarrant was whispering to herself or to God. Colonel Branshaw prowled. Kelm stood motionless by the bookshelf. Sloane watched everyone while seeming to watch no one. I moved once around the room, careful where I put my feet. There was no weapon visible, The wound in Vale's chest suggested a narrow blade. On the desk lay a silver letter opener, but clean and too blunt. One drawer stood open an inch, not enough to mean much. Then my eye caught the chair opposite the desk, near the hearth. It had been moved recently. One front leg stood on the fringe of the rug, the other three on bare floor. More important, a faint wet mark showed on the leather seat, the kind left by a damp coat or sleeve. Reed had entered the house without an overcoat. That might mean nothing. It might mean he had left it elsewhere. It might mean a lot. I bent a little and saw another item, a dark thread caught on the carved arm, not black, not blue, but brown with a reddish cast. Expensive cloth, from a coat perhaps. "Don't touch," Sloane said. I wasn't planning to carry it home. I straightened. "Did Reed come to the study with the rest of you?" "Yes," Sloane said. "Did he stay?" Sloane hesitated a hair. "For a minute or two. Then, Vale asked us all to wait while he spoke privately with him." That was new. "All of you left?" "Number, I was nearest the door." Reed went into the rear library with Vale. The others remained. Then Vale called for coffee. After that, he gestured toward the corpse. Colonel Branshaw barked. "Not exactly. Vale told us to go into the drawing room and send coffee in. He said he would join us shortly. Reed had already gone through that door." I looked at him. "And you all left Vale alone?" "With Reed somewhere beyond," Branshaw said. "Or gone," Miss Honora said in a flat voice. "You imply too much, Mr. Goodwin." I gave her one. "Madam, a man sits in a forbidden chair, is invited into a private conference, and disappears before the host is found dead. I imply exactly enough." Peter Vale snapped. "He did it." No one contradicted him aloud, which in a room full of intelligent people is not the same as agreement. The police came 8 minutes later, with wet coats, hard shoes, and the comforting absence of delicacy. The first uniformed sergeant took one look and started arranging bodies, living and dead, into official categories. Behind him came Lieutenant Rocliffe from Manhattan Homicide, broad-faced and confident in his own irritation. I knew him, and the knowledge was mutual and unfortunate. He saw me, and his upper lip moved. "Goodwin," I might have guessed. "Lieutenant, nice night for indoor work." He grunted, took in the room, the corpse, the family, and the general odor of money interrupted by violence. "Nobody leaves." "Not one of my hobbies," I said. He set his men moving, then turned to me. "You found him." "I found the room after he was found. I was in the drawing room." He jerked his head. "You'll tell it downstairs later. I charge extra for repetition." He ignored that, which was wise, and began his preliminary questions. The household gave names, positions, fragments. Reed's absence thickened by the minute. A patrolman was sent to search upstairs. Another took the back stairs and cellar. Ashcroft House, for all its size, had begun to feel too small. While Rocliffe was occupied with Miss Honora, I drifted toward Partridge. A butler under stress can sometimes be induced to mislay discretion for 10 seconds. "That chair," I murmured. "Who sat in it last before tonight?" His face did not alter, but his eyelids lowered a fraction. "Mr. Arthur Vale, sir." "Peter's father?" "Yes, sir." "How long has it remained empty?" "Since Mr. Arthur's death." "By order of whom?" "Mr. Gideon Vale." "Then why did Gideon permit Reed to sit there?" Partridge's gaze moved once involuntarily toward the dead man. "I could not say, sir." "Could, but would rather keep your job." He inhaled very slightly. Mr. Reed sat where he was told. That was all I got before Rocliffe started barking my name. So, there it was. The stranger had not chosen the chair. He had been directed to it by whom was not in doubt. By why was the whole case. I looked once more at Gideon Vale slumped at his desk. The rain on the windows behind him, the rigid faces, the old house with its old rules. And I knew I would be carrying more than a routine report back to West 35th Street. Because a wrong chair is one thing, A wrong chair assigned on purpose is another. And somewhere between the two, Gideon Vale had got himself killed. Chapter 2. The rule no one explained by midnight, Ashcroft House had stopped pretending to be a residence and become what any rich house becomes when murder enters it. A well-upholstered pen. The servants moved in whispers, the family with injured dignity, and the police with the practical conviction that no amount of money had ever yet improved a dead man. I had already been taken once through my account by Lieutenant Rocliffe, who never let familiarity soften his manners. When I had finished, he looked as if I had personally arranged Gideon Vale's death to inconvenience the department. "You were there as a detective," he said. "No," I told him. "As a decorative object, the tuxedo fooled you." He grunted, "Wolfe on it." Wolfe is on a chair in his office, unless the house has burned down. That gave him nothing pleasant to say, so he went to extract statements from people with weaker digestion. Then Detective Ruth Mercer arrived. I learned the name before I learned the woman, because a uniformed man at the door said, "Detective Mercer's here." And 3 people in the room turned as if they expected rescue and disliked the source. She came in without bustle, handed her wet hat to no one because no one had yet offered, and crossed the hall with the unhurried stride of a person who knew that once a room had seen murder, it would keep for 5 minutes more. She was in her middle 30s, perhaps, though competence makes age harder to guess. Medium height, dark hair pinned back with no ornament, grey eyes that missed nothing because they wasted nothing, and a face not soft enough to invite foolishness. Her coat was rain, dark at the shoulders. When she removed it, she revealed a plain dark suit and the kind of economy in movement that comes either from discipline or from knowing that if you do not claim your space, someone will take it. Rocliffe met her at the study door with the expression of a man preparing to object to weather. "Mercer, Lieutenant." Her voice was even and not friendly. Commissioner's office asked for a second pair of eyes. Prominent victim, delicate household. That was kind of them. I thought so. He did not like it, but he stepped aside. She entered the study, stood a moment looking at Gideon Vale where he still slumped at the desk, and let her gaze travel once around the room. Not slowly, not theatrically, thoroughly. Then she said, "Who found him first?" Rocliffe jerked a thumb. Goodwin was among them. She turned to me. "Nero Wolfe's Goodwin. That is one of the names people use when they want something." Her eyes rested on me for the length of a civil blink. "Then you observe. I try not to make a fetish of it. Good later." She moved to the desk. That was my introduction to Ruth Mercer, and I approved it. Any detective who wastes no time resenting my existence is already ahead of Rocliffe. She examined the body without touching more than necessary, asked Dr. Sloane 2 short questions regarding the wound and estimated time, then went to the chair by the hearth. She noticed the shifted leg on the rug and the faint wet mark on the leather seat. I could tell because her glance paused there and sharpened. "You saw this?" she asked without looking up. "Yes." "You touch it." "Numbers splendid. That saves me 1 irritations." She straightened and faced the room. By then most of the principals had been herded into the study or just beyond it, because police hate distance when statements are fresh. Miss Honora sat rigid on a straight chair as if upholstering could be morally compromising. Peter Vale stood with his fists in his pockets and temper in his face. Julian Kelm had resumed his secretary's art of appearing to take up no space while occupying it all. Colonel Branshaw carried outrage like a decoration. Mrs. Tarrant seemed near collapse, but not near enough to be useful. Dr. Sloane remained watchful. Elias Reed remained absent. Mercer said, "I would like the significance of the dining room," Chair explained. That landed harder than some accusations. Miss Honora's chin lifted. Peter glanced at Kelm. Branshaw made a noise. No one spoke. Mercer waited 3 seconds. "If silence is a family custom, you may keep it for church. Here it wastes time," Rocliffe said. "They've all danced around it." I noticed the footprints. She kept her eyes on the veils. "Who explains the chair?" Miss Honora said coldly. "It is a private matter." It does not. How do you know? Because. She stopped. Peter Vale said abruptly. Because no one wants to say the name. Miss Honora turned on him. Peter. Oh, spare me. His voice cracked not from grief, but from long compression. We've all been playing at ghosts for years. Mercer shifted to him. Whose name? He looked toward the doorway, toward the dining room, beyond it perhaps, toward 20 years of rules. Rowan. Nothing moved in the room, but the air changed, Mercer said. Rowan Vale. Yes, relation to Gideon Vale. Peter swallowed. His son. That surprised me enough that I nearly let it show. Peter was the nephew. Gideon's son had not been mentioned at dinner, not even by accident. In houses like Ashcroft one does not misplace a son unless everyone has agreed to help. Mercer let the pause sit. Where is Rowan Vale now? No one answered, she said. Dead. Miss Honora said. We do not know. Missing. Yes. How long? Kelm supplied it. Perhaps because figures are safer than feelings. 22 years. Mercer turned her head. Missing for 22 years, and his chair is kept empty at family dinners. Not family dinners, Miss Honora said sharply. At formal dinners in this house. Mercer's eyes narrowed by the smallest fraction. That distinction matters to you. It mattered to Gideon. Why? Miss Honora's mouth compressed. Because it was his house. Mercer ignored the defense. Tell me about Rowan Vale. Again there was resistance. At last, Dr. Sloane said quietly. He left at 19 after a violent quarrel with his father. Over what? Control, Peter said. What else ever happened here? Miss Honora gave him a look that would have frozen steam. He did not care, Mercer said. He vanished completely. Kelm answered. There were letters at first. Then none. There were rumors. South America, California, a ship, a mine, a woman. Gideon pursued some of them and dismissed all. After 5 years he declared Rowan dead, in all but law, and kept his chair empty. Yes, Miss Honora said, because Gideon had rules. That was the first honest sentence anyone had produced without help. Mercer walked to the mantel and stood with one elbow on it, not lounging, merely occupying. Then Elias Reed sits in Rowan Vale's chair. No one stops him. Gideon lets it stand. I am asked to believe that is unconnected to what followed. Miss Honora said, Mr. Reed could not have known. No, Mercer said. Which is exactly why I am interested, I said, unless someone told him. Her glance cut to me. Did someone? That depends how charitable you feel toward coincidence. Peter spoke fast. The butler told Goodwin Reed sat where he was told. All heads turned. Partridge, standing near the door in the background like a carved witness, did not flinch, though his color worsened. Mercer said, Did you, Partridge? Yes, madam. By whom? Mr. Vale. Personally. Yes, madam. There it was. Not the chair chosen, but assigned. The room felt it. Mercer moved one step toward the butler, when, in the dining room, moments before dinner, Mr. Vale instructed me that when Mr. Reed entered, he was to be shown to that place. Were you surprised? A servant may lie with perfect grammar. Partridge chose truth instead. Yes, madam. Did Mr. Reed appear surprised? No, madam. That interested her. It interested me too, she said. Had Reed been in this house before? Partridge hesitated. Not to my knowledge. Peter barked a laugh. To your knowledge. That covers centuries. Mercer, let that go. Who here knew Rowan Vale well enough to compare him with Reed? No one answered at once. Then Mrs. Tarrant, from her chair, in a thin, shaken voice. I did. Rowan was all quickness, laughter, anger. That man Reed was not like him. Miss Honora said. No one suggested he was. Mercer turned. No. Then why the chair? Why summon a stranger and seat him in the place of a missing son? No answer. She changed direction. Mr. Kelm, you're the secretary. What threatening communications did Gideon Vale receive? Kelm moistened his lips. Unsigned notes. Over 10 days. Short, cryptic, contents. He looked toward Miss Honora, then gave up. One said, "A place kept empty is still occupied." Another, "The house remembers what the family buries." The last one mentioned the sun at table. "That beat the rain for chill," Mercer said. "You saw these notes?" "Yes." "Where are they? In Mr. Vale's safe, or were?" Rowcliffe growled. "We'll get them." Mercer nodded. "Do that." Then to Kelm, "Did Gideon believe the notes referred to Rowan?" "Yes." Why, Kelm took a breath. "Because no outsider should have known about the chair," I said. "Then we've got two problems. Either someone inside the house wrote the notes, or someone outside knew the inside well enough to hurt him with it." Mercer's eyes met mine. "Yes." Rowcliffe looked as if he regretted my literacy. Mercer resumed, "How did Elias Reed enter the picture?" Miss Honora said, "Gideon sent for him." "From where?" "Boston, I believe," Kelm said. "At least that was the address attached to the telegram." "Telegram?" Mercer asked. "Yes. Mr. Vale sent one 3 days ago." "To whom exactly?" Kelm answered. "Elias Reed. No other identification," Mercer said. "And Gideon told no one why?" "No," Miss Honora said. "He told no one anything that mattered." That had grief in it now, or something as close as she permitted herself. Mercer walked once to the desk and back, thinking. It showed not in her face, but in the stillness of her hands. Finally she said, "This murder may have occurred in the last half hour. It may also have begun 22 years ago. A missing son, a preserved seat, anonymous notes. A summoned stranger placed deliberately in that seat. Then Gideon Vale dies before explaining any of it." She looked at each of them in turn. "What you have here," she said, "is not only a dead man, it is a family arrangement. Those are usually harder to open than locks." No one liked that, which recommended it. Rowcliffe had one of his men bring in the contents of the safe from the study wall. Among papers and envelopes were 4 notes, all on plain paper, all printed in block capitals. Mercer read them where she stood. I could not see every word, but I saw enough. Kelm had quoted one accurately. Another said, "He will sit where you left him." Another, "You kept the place. Keep the account." Mercer handed them to Rowcliffe, then asked, "Any sign of Reed?" A uniformed man at the door said, "No, ma'am. House, grounds, cellar, roof access, nothing." "So he vanished," she said. Peter Vale muttered, "Like Rowan." That was not a comparison, anyone answered. Mercer turned to me. "Goodwin, you're going back to Wolfe. As soon as these pleasant ceremonies release me. Tell him this is not a simple stranger kills, host seen. I had already reached that far unaided. I assumed you might." Her mouth almost considered a smile and declined. "Tell him the first lie in this house was old before the body cooled." That was well put. Better than most cops manage at midnight. I looked toward the hall leading to the dining room, where somewhere beyond the silver and candles there stood a chair kept empty for a son who had vanished, and filled tonight by a man no one claimed to know, and everyone feared to explain. Mercer was right. The murder had not started with the blow. That was only the point at which a long-hidden rule had finally asked to be paid for. Chapter 3. A son swallowed by the house at 1:30 in the morning. I left Ashcroft House with rain still coming down in a thin, persistent slant, and the city looking as if it had been rubbed with oil. I might have gone home, but home in my case included Nero Wolfe, and when a man is paid to observe one murder, one vanished guest, and one family history sour enough to curdle cream, he does not take it to bed and hope it improves by morning. Wolfe was in the office when I entered the old brownstone on West 35th Street. That was no surprise. A case may disturb his schedule, but it takes artillery to move him from his chair before his chosen hour. The lamp by his desk was on. The red leather chair held 6/7 of him. A book lay open but ignored. Fritz had left cold sandwiches and beer on the side table, which was his way of expressing sympathy without endorsing criminal activity after midnight. Wolfe opened his eyes. "Well, I gave it to him, and gave it all, because there are times when my natural gifts for style and selection must yield to his appetite for detail. I started with the dinner, the stranger, the chair, the collective paralysis, the private conference, the corpse, the missing man, the notes, and Detective Ruth Mercer. I ended with the revelation that the chair had belonged to Gideon Vale's vanished son Rowan, missing 22 years. Wolfe shut his eyes again when I finished. That meant he was thinking, which in him resembles disdain at rest. Finally he said, "Popfur, it helps." "It is intended to," you said the butler stated, "Reed was placed in that chair by Gideon's order." Yes. Then Gideon meant a declaration, either to Reed or to the others. Mercer thought the murder started years ago. She may have intelligence. Continue to regard her with caution. That's warm for you. He ignored it. What do you know of Rowan Vale? Very little. 19 when he vanished. Quarreled with Gideon. Letters at first, then none. Gideon treated him as dead except for preserving the chair. Which is absurd. Yes, families do that. Families do many idiotic things, and then label them tradition. He opened his eyes. The son is central, not necessarily because he lives, but because someone profits from his absence. Mercer is looking into it. Then she will question servants, inspect papers, and endure lies. She is welcome to the occupation. He took a sandwich triangle, bit it, chewed, and added, "Go to bed. At 10 tomorrow call on Mr. Kelm or Miss Honora. I want photographs, letters, descriptions, and facts. If Rowan Vale vanished into melodrama, I detest him already, but he may yet be useful." I nodded and turned. "Archie." "Yes. If Lieutenant Rowcliffe attempts to bully you, bully him first. It saves time." That was Wolfe at his most affectionate. By 10:30 the next morning, I was back at Ashcroft House, which looked less guilty in daylight, but not innocent. The rain had stopped. The limestone front was pale again, the windows dull, the brass polished, as if murder had been only another guest to be wiped up after breakfast. A uniformed man at the door looked resigned when he saw me and let me in. Detective Mercer was already there. I found her in the morning room with Julian Kelm, 2 cardboard boxes, a notebook, and an expression that suggested sleep had been regarded as optional. She glanced up. "Goodwin." "Mercer. Wolfe sent condolences?" "He sent appetite. He wants facts on Rowan Vale. That improves him. I'll tell him." She returned to the box nearest her. "Then collect facts. They're scattered among 40 years of money and repression." The morning room had chintz chairs and long windows facing a narrow garden that had probably once been useful to women in white dresses, and is now useful only to gardeners and melancholy. On a table were photographs in silver frames, stacks of loose papers, 2 old leather albums, and an inventory list in Kelm's neat hand. Kelm looked worse than he had at midnight. His beard was trimmed, his collar correct, but fatigue had worked on the skin under his eyes. "Miss Honora has permitted access to family records insofar as they may bear on Mr. Gideon Vale's death." "That was large of her," I said. His mouth moved. "You may be disappointed by the tone of the morning." "After last night, disappointment would actually cheer me." Mercer picked up a photograph and handed it to me. Rowan. The boy in the picture was perhaps 16, thin, dark-haired, long-faced, with a mouth too alive to stay solemn for a camera. He stood beside a horse, and was apparently pretending patience with the photographer. The eyes were Gideon's, only if Gideon had ever once laughed honestly. I said, "Not Reed, not literally, but enough in the cheek, the eyes, and the timing to make an old man's memory misfire." "No," Mercer said. "Not the same man, but close enough in outline to frighten anyone already expecting a ghost." I turned the photo over. "Rowan North Shore, age 16, was written in a woman's delicate hand." "There's more," Mercer said. "There was. An album yielded 6 photographs, none recent enough to help if Rowan had lived into another face, but enough to draw a boy, quick, restless, often turned half aside as if his body wanted to be elsewhere before the shutter had clicked. In only one picture did Gideon appear beside him. Father and son stood on stone steps in formal coats. Gideon looked carved. Rowan looked contained. Mercer said, "Look at the spacing." I did. A hand could have been slipped between them. A hand could have been slipped between them, Kelm said quietly. Mr. Gideon was not demonstrative. That is the cleanest euphemism I've heard this week, I said. Mercer had already moved to the papers. You told me Rowan left after a quarrel. What you did not tell me was that half the household records avoid his name. Kelm stiffened. Avoid? Yes. Master Rav on some bills. The younger gentleman, in-house memoranda. Instruction from upstairs in correspondence with tutors. She lifted a sheet. No mother mentioned after his 12th year. No school named after 15. No public appearances except a few clipped notices. Either Gideon Vale was protective to the point of pathology, or he was hiding the boy. That got my attention. From whom? Mercer looked at me. Maybe from the world, maybe from himself, Kelm said. That is an unwarranted interpretation. Mercer folded the sheet and set it down. Then warranted another way. He hesitated, then said, Rowan was difficult, meaning impulsive, defiant, prone to scenes. Children are often defiant, Mercer said. It doesn't usually require erasure. That word hung there. I went through a smaller stack and found a school report, unsigned copy, with the letterhead trimmed off. Bright but disorderly, strong verbal ability, unsatisfactory conduct, withdrawn from term at father's request. Another paper was an invoice from a private tutor in history and languages. Another from a specialist physician on East 63rd Street, politely enclosing a bill for continued consultations. I handed that one to Mercer. She read it and raised her brows. Consultations, Kelm said too quickly. A childhood condition. What condition? I don't know. Then don't volunteer innocence, Mercer said. He flushed. It improved him a little. At 11, Miss Honora entered. She wore dove, grey silk and disapproval, as if both were hereditary. She had slept, or at least lain down among expensive blankets and refused defeat. Her gaze touched Mercer, then me, then the boxes on the table. Must my family history be pored over like old costumes? She asked. Mercer said, only the parts that may explain why your brother was threatened with a vanished son and then murdered. Miss Honora's mouth thinned. You assume too much importance in the son. Mercer said, on the contrary, your family spent 2 decades assigning it. That landed. Honora crossed to the mantel and stood with one hand resting on it. Rowan was not erased, she said. He was protected. By being kept out of sight, Mercer asked. He was delicate, I said. Photographs don't show delicate. They show angry. Miss Honora swung to me. You know nothing of him. That's why I'm here. Her eyes flicked once toward the albums, and when they came back they had something under the frost now, not softness. Where Rowan was Gideon's only child. His mother died when he was 12. After that, Gideon grew harder with him. Not softer. He thought. Discipline could replace grief. It never does, Mercer said. Why the secrecy? Why unnamed schools, private tutors, special doctors? Miss Honora answered after a pause. Because Rowan did not please Gideon's notion of a son. There are sentences that open doors without seeming to. Mercer heard it too. In what way? She asked. Miss Honora looked at the garden, not at us. He was sensitive, bookish, changeable. He disliked the business, disliked sport when commanded to like it, hated being displayed, and had a talent for saying exactly the thing Gideon least wished heard. If he had been merely rebellious, they would have survived each other. But he also frightened Gideon. How? Mercer asked. Miss Honora turned back. By seeing him. No one spoke for a second. Then Mercer said, The quarrel. Tell me. It was after dinner. Rowan was 19. There had been some matter of money, some matter of companions Gideon disapproved, some matter of threats about Europe or exile or disinheritance. they shouted. Rowan said he would leave and never return. Gideon said if he crossed the threshold in that spirit, his place in the house would be finished. And yet the chair remained. Honora gave a small, bitter smile. Yes, my brother was never so absolute as when contradicting himself. Did Rowan write after leaving? For a while. Do you have the letters? Number Mercer's eyes sharpened. Destroyed. By Gideon, I think, or kept where I never found them, Kelm said. There may be some copies or references in the desk files, Mercer said. Then we'll look. We did, in Gideon's study. The police had finished their first pass, though the room still smelled of interruption. Rowcliffe was out chasing warrants, or Elias Reed, or his own temper. A young officer stood by to object if anyone pocketed silver. Mercer ignored him with professional ease and went through the desk again, this time with Kelm opening locked compartments and naming categories. We found business correspondence, legal drafts, dinner lists, a memorandum on charitable subscriptions, and a sealed packet marked private. Mercer opened it. Inside were 3 letters and 1 recent envelope. The letters were old, folded thin with handling. All were signed Rowan. The first was from Montreal, written in a fast slashing hand, alive, working, no thanks needed. Don't send men after me. The second, from New Orleans 6 months later. You want obedience more than a son. The third, undated, and from no stated place, was shorter and stranger. It said, you may keep the chair if it comforts you. A chair is cheaper than honesty. Mercer handed that one to me. There's your wound. The recent envelope held no letter, only a slip of paper. Cream stock, typed. The heir is returning. Prepare his place. No signature, no postmark. It had been delivered. Kelm stared at it. I never saw this, Mercer said. When did Gideon receive it? Kelm swallowed. I don't know. You sought his correspondence. Not all of it. Convenient. Miss Honora had gone very pale. That paper was in his desk. Yes, Mercer said. She sat down suddenly, in Gideon's chair opposite the desk, then stood at once as if stung. He said nothing. He let all this proceed and said nothing. I said, maybe he was waiting to see who flinched. Mercer looked at the typed slip again, or he already knew enough to be afraid. We found one more thing before noon. In the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, behind real estate plats and tax records, there was a packet of newspaper clippings tied with faded blue ribbon. All concerned Rowan, but cautiously. Society items mentioning Mr. Gideon Vale and his son. A small notice of the mother's death. Then nothing for years until one clipping from a Boston paper, 15 years earlier, reporting a man detained after a tavern fight under the name Rowan Vale. Not Vale, released with a fine, no photo. Kept by Gideon, I said, Kelm. Nodded. Apparently, Mercer's expression did not change, but it became more exact. So he watched, Miss Honora said faintly. He never forgave. That does not mean he did not watch. There was another silence then. Not the defensive silence of dinner, but the older kind underneath it, the kind produced when a family has carried one fact too long and worn grooves around it. Rowan Vale had not been merely absent. He had been administered, hidden when present, denied when gone, preserved in ritual, tracked in secret, and now resurrected by letters someone had fed into the old machinery of fear. Mercer said it plainly. Someone was stirring this before the dinner. The notes, the hand, delivered warning, the invitation to read. None of that begins last night. No, I said. Last night was just when the house had to admit it remembered. She nodded. From somewhere upstairs a door closed softly. In the front hall a servant crossed and recrossed with the soundless tread of inherited obedience. Ashcroft House, which had spent 22 years swallowing the name Rowan as if it were a bone, was beginning to speak. Not loudly, not willingly, but enough. And in houses like that, once the whispers start, murder is only one of the things that comes out. Chapter 4. The man with the borrowed face. At 1:30 that afternoon, Elias Reed came back. He did not sneak in through the service entrance, climb from a cellar hatch, or get discovered in a linen closet behind winter blankets. He walked through the front door of Ashcroft House, as if the house, the police, and the corpse upstairs had merely delayed an appointment. A patrolman tried to stop him. Reed handed over a card, removed damp gloves, and said in the same low, composed voice I remembered from dinner, "Detective Mercer asked to be informed if I returned. Please oblige her." The patrolman, who had not been instructed in the proper treatment of absent dinner guests, wanted for inquiry in connection with murder, gaped, and sent for a superior. By the time I reached the hall from Gideon Vale's study, Reed was standing under the big chandelier with his hat in his hand, looking neither apologetic nor defiant. He looked tired. That improved him. Detective Ruth Mercer came down the main staircase at an even pace, not hurrying because hurrying credits the other person with advantage. Lieutenant Rowcliffe arrived from the rear hall a step later and looked cheated that Reed had not chosen a method allowing immediate roughness. Mercer stopped 3 feet from the man. "Mr. Reed, we've been looking for you." "So I supposed." "That was thoughtful of you. In my room, then at a lawyer's office, I imagined you would locate both without strain." Rowcliffe's face thickened. "After a man gets killed in front of you, you don't stroll off to a hotel." "I did not stroll. I left through the rear library because Mr. Vale instructed me to. By the time I reached the street, I judged that whatever was about to occur in that house would be better approached in daylight and with counsel." "That's a dainty story," Rowcliffe said. Mercer cut in before he could enjoy himself. "You'll tell it properly in the morning room." She looked at me. "Goodwin, since you're apparently glued to this house, join us. If Wolfe wants facts, he may as well have them fresh." That was Mercer, practical enough to use whatever was in reach, including me. We went into the morning room, Mercer, Rowcliffe, Reed, Julian Kelm, and I. Miss Honora refused at first to attend any polis audience, then changed her mind and entered 2 minutes later, as if she had come only to preserve standards. Peter Vale arrived uninvited. Dr. Sloane drifted in and remained by the window. Colonel Branshaw was excluded by Mercer, with a firmness that nearly made him explode. She had the door shut. Reed sat where told. Notably, he glanced once at the chairs before choosing none for himself. Mercer opened. "State your full name." "Elias Martin Reed." "Age?" 41. "Birthplace?" "Philadelphia." "Occupation?" He made the faintest motion with one shoulder. "Independent researcher, occasional investigator for firms that dislike using their own names." "That sounds manufactured," Rowcliffe said. "It often is," Reed replied. "People pay for discretion in better language than truth deserves." Mercer ignored the exchange. "Last night you sat in a chair preserved for Rowan Vale, Gideon's missing son. Did you know that chair's significance? Number did Gideon tell you? Number did anyone in the house tell you?" Number Mercer watched him. "Then why did you not seem surprised when seated there?" "I was surprised. I did not display it because Mr. Vale was watching me, and I dislike being used." That answer made Peter Vale utter a short, nasty laugh. "Used for what? Family theatre?" Reed turned his head. "I am beginning to think so," Mercer said. "You deny you are Rowan Vale?" "Yes." "Promptly?" "Yes." "Too promptly?" Peter demanded. Reed looked at him with weary patience. "Mr. Vale, if you spend the night being silently accused of existing under another name, you may discover speed." Mercer asked, "Had anyone ever mistaken you for Rowan before?" Reed paused. "Not by name." That sharpened the room. "In what way?" she said. "Twice in the past year strangers looked at me too long after hearing my surname. Once in Boston. Once in Hartford. It suggested confusion, not recognition." "Did you inquire?" "Yes, the first man denied it. The second apologized and left." Mercer leaned back. "Tell us about your dealings with Gideon Vale." Reed folded his hands. Good hands. I noticed then, long fingers, one old scar across the knuckles of the left. 3 weeks ago I received an anonymous letter enclosing copies of trust abstracts and one clipped item regarding the disappearance of Rowan Vale. The letter suggested that Gideon Vale had altered old family arrangements to the disadvantage of certain beneficiaries, and that the truth lay buried under changed names. Kelm stiffened. Miss Honora went still enough to hear. Mercer said, "Showed this to anyone? My attorney has the letter now. Why come to Gideon Vale rather than to the police?" "Because at first I thought it financial, not criminal," Rowcliffe snorted. "And rich men are famous for confessing account tricks over dinner." Reed did not bother with him. "I made inquiries quietly. Some records existed, then ceased too. A guardian's notation in one county archive, a supplemental trust memorandum in Boston referencing a beneficiary whose surname had been altered. Old servants' names that disappeared from payroll lists in the same year Rowan Vale vanished." Mercer said, "What surname?" Weed looked at her. "Vane." That landed hard enough to be heard. Peter frowned. "Vane. Yes, in 2 records the younger beneficiary was listed not as Vale, but as Rowan Vane. One document corrected it in pen. The other disappeared when I asked for a certified copy," Kelm said sharply. "That proves nothing. Clerical errors happen." Reed turned. "Repeatedly. Around one family, one missing heir, and one set of trust holdings. Yes, they do, but not by chance." Mercer asked, "Why did this interest you personally?" That was the important question, and she knew it. Reed took a breath. "Because the anonymous letter also said I should look in a mirror." No one moved, Mercer said. "Meaning resemblance." "So I inferred." Peter Vale stared openly now, as did Miss Honora despite herself. In daylight, with the family prepared for comparison, the likeness was not dramatic enough for melodrama, but more dangerous than that, fragmentary and therefore arguable. Reed had the right age within reason, a similar build to the older photographs, a certain line at the cheek, a way of turning the head before answering. If you wanted him to be Rowan, you had material. If you did not, you had objections ready. "That is the most explosive kind of resemblance," Mercer said. "Remove your glasses." He did. He had worn rimless ones that were so discreet. I had half ignored them. Without them, his face altered slightly. Not enough to settle anything, enough to deepen it. Miss Honora made a sound, very low, almost not a sound at all. Reed looked at her. "I'm sorry." "For what?" she asked. "For resembling your trouble." That was a damned good line, and I regretted not thinking of it first. Mercer said, "At dinner, Gideon recognized something in you." "Yes." "What?" Reed's mouth thinned. "Fear, anger, calculation. Choose any 2. Did he call you Rowan?" "Number." "What did he say when you met privately?" Reed glanced at Rowcliffe, then back to Mercer. "He took me into the rear library and asked who had sent me. And I told him no one had sent me. I said I had received information concerning old trust arrangements and the possibility of a concealed identity connected with his missing son." Miss Honora closed her eyes once, Reed continued. "He asked to see the copies I had brought. I showed him 2 abstracts and the anonymous letter. He read them. His hand shook only once, which I admired under the circumstances. Then he asked whether I claimed to be Rowan Vale. And you said no." "Yes." "Immediately." "Yes, because I do not." Peter snapped. "That's convenient." Reed turned to him. "You want me to be him because it would simplify your life. I recommend against rearranging facts for comfort." Peter flushed and half rose. Mercer said, "Sit down." And he did, because she had put steel in it. She faced Reed again. "If you are not Rowan, why did Gideon place you in Rowan's chair?" Reed answered without hesitation. "To frighten the family, or to test them, or both. And you allowed it. I wanted to see who flinched." He and Mercer looked at each other for a second, and there was recognition there, not friendly, but professional. 2 people who had both used discomfort as a lever. "After the private talk," Mercer said. "What happened?" "He told me he required time. He asked me to remain through dinner and afterward wait in the rear library. He said he intended to make a statement to certain members of the household." "Did he?" "Number after dinner he brought Miss Vale, Colonel Branshaw, and Dr. Sloane toward the study. He then told them to go back to the drawing room and asked me into the library again. He said, Reed paused. He said, "If this is a trick, it will fail. If it is not a trick, I have been a fool longer than I believed." Mercer said. Then, he asked whether my left shoulder bore a scar. That made my head come up. Reed's left hand moved reflexively, almost to the shoulder, and stopped. He said Rowan had such a scar. Reed went on, "From a fall at 11. I told him I had a scar on my shoulder from a childhood accident. Yes, but that many men do. He stared at me as if the answer had insulted him," Miss Honora whispered. "Dear God," Mercer said. "Did you show him?" Number, why not? Because by then I understood the scene had ceased to be about records and become about something far older and less sane. Rocliffe said, "That's when you decided to kill him." Reed looked honestly bored for the first time. "Lieutenant, if I had killed him, I would not have returned at luncheon." Rocliffe opened his mouth. Mercer overrode him. "Continue." Reed said, "Gideon told me to wait in the rear library while he fetched a file. Instead, he stepped to the desk, rang for coffee, and told the others to withdraw. He remained in the study. I went into the library as instructed. I waited perhaps 1 minute. Then I heard raised voices. "Whose?" Mercer asked. One was Gideon's, the other I could not place male. Peter said sharply, "That's a lie. We were all in the drawing room." Reed turned. Then someone else was not. That gave everyone a moment's pause, including Mercer. She said, "What words did you hear?" "Only fragments," Gideon said. "You chose badly. Then, it should have remained buried." After that, a crash or heavy movement. I stepped toward the study door, then stopped. I had no wish to be found in the middle of Vale family history when it detonated. I went out through the service passage. Rocliffe was disgusted. "You hear trouble and leave." "Yes," Reed said, "I am still alive," which suggests prudence has uses. Mercer asked, "Why come back now?" He reached into his inside pocket. Rocliffe stiffened, then relaxed when Reed produced only an envelope. "Because this was under my hotel door at 10 this morning." Mercer took it, opened it, and read. Her face did not change. She handed it to me. The note, typed like the others, said, "He borrowed the face. Ask who borrowed the name." Below that, in pencil, a single line had been added by hand. "Trust the third ledger, not the first." Mercer took it back. "You brought this to us rather than to your attorney." "Yes, because by then I accepted that Mr. Vale's death and Rowan Vale's disappearance were the same inquiry." She said it before I could. "Yes." Miss Honora rose abruptly and crossed to the window. Her reflection in the glass looked older than the woman. "This is monstrous," she said. Mercer's voice stayed level. "Maybe, but it is also organized." Kelm spoke too quickly again. "These trust records, if such things exist, they can be explained. Old estates are often restructured. Names appear in variant forms, guardianship, provisions." "Stop," Mercer said. He stopped. She went on. "Mr. Reed carries the right age. He may or may not carry the right history. He bears a scar consistent with a memory Gideon apparently held. He denies being Rowan, which does not clear him and does not condemn him. He has been investigating Gideon's old dealings, trust records, and vanished names. Gideon saw enough in him to stage a provocation at dinner and then hold a private conference. 1 hour later, Gideon was dead." She looked from Reed to Honora, to Kelm, to Peter, to me. "The son and the murder are one case now. They may have been one case 22 years ago too." Peter said, "Then prove whether he's Rowan." Mercer turned to Reed. "Can you prove you are Lilias Reed?" "Yes," he said. "Birth certificate, school records, military registration, tax files. Enough paper to satisfy a republic. And all genuine, as far as I know. As far as you know." He met her gaze. "Detective, when anonymous people begin mailing you your own face, certainty develops seams." That was the most honest thing anyone had said all day. Mercer nodded once, very slightly. "Fair." I looked at Reed then with more care than before. He was almost certainly not Rowan, but he might have been mistaken for him, used as him, or dropped into the machinery by someone who understood Gideon Vale's nerves better than Gideon himself did. But whatever he was not incidental. And Gideon had recognized something in him, not necessarily blood. Recognition is often older and more dangerous than that. A gesture, a scar, a name misfiled and revived. A man standing where a vanished son ought to have been. Mercer rose. "Mr. Reed, you are not under arrest yet. Do not regard that as praise. You will remain available." I had planned to. "Good, Mr. Kelm. I want every trust record, estate supplement, guardianship paper, and family settlement involving Gideon Vale, Rowan Vane, or any similar variant from the last 30 years. Kelm looked as if his pulse had relocated. "That may require legal review," Mercer said. "Then review while walking. I want them." She turned to me as the others began rearranging their shock. "Goodwin, tell Wolfe one more thing." "What?" "That in this house, faces may be borrowed, names too. I'm beginning to think the one thing no one ever kept straight was the child." I nodded, because she was right. Ashcroft House had spent 22 years preserving a chair while mislaying a son. Now a man with the right age, the right scar, and a half-familiar face had come in out of the rain, and the dead man had known enough to tremble. That was no longer family tragedy. That was structure. Chapter 5. The study with the quiet window. "I did not write the letters," he said. "But I knew Gideon was being pressed, and I did nothing to stop those who found that useful." That was what Detective Ruth Mercer said to me at 4 o'clock that afternoon, standing in Gideon Vale's study with a small flashlight in one hand and impatience in the other. The body was gone by then, the coroner having taken Gideon away and left behind the larger burden of explaining how he had died. The rug had been marked, the desk photographed, the coffee cup tagged, the household reduced to corridors and whispers. But the room itself still wore its impossible face. The French windows to the terrace were locked from within. The study door showed no sign of force. The rear door into the library had not been tampered with. Nothing about it was impossible, only arranged to look cleaner than it had been. And on the desk, near enough to insult intelligence, lay the weapon, a slim Italian paper knife with an ivory handle, sharp enough for vanity, and in the right place, sharp enough for murder. Lieutenant Rowcliffe, who likes certainty the way some men like Rye, had already adopted it. Reed had used the knife and slipped away. It satisfied him because it required only one active brain, and not necessarily his. Mercer was not buying. She stood by the desk, bent slightly, and shone the light not at the obvious objects but under them. "If this were as simple as it looks," she said, "the room wouldn't be trying so hard. You think the knife was planted. I think anything placed within easy reach after a murder is either truth or advertising. In this house, I'm discounting advertising first." I leaned on the bookshelf without touching it. "That's poetry from a detective. Number, it's fatigue." She nodded toward the windows. "Check the latch again." I did. The brass fitting on the left French door was old, polished and solid locked. No scratches fresh enough to help. Rain specked glass beyond it. Terrace stone, clipped hedges, and the narrow-walled yard that made Ashcroft House seem less like a residence than a private institution with better linen. "Still locked," I said. "It was always going to be." She crossed to the vent grate low in the panelled wall near the hearth. "What interests me is what a room like this was built to hide before anyone asked it to hide murder." The study had that kind of richness, which often means old money and old habits. Dark paneling, leather chairs, built in shelves, carved molding, and rugs thick enough to bury sound. A room meant for command, privacy, and selective memory. Houses like Ashcroft House had been built by men who did not enjoy being overheard, and yet wished to overhear everyone else. Mercer crouched at the vent. "This grille was painted over 3 times and removed recently. You can tell that from there." "I can tell because the screws are cleaner than the wall." She looked up. "Fetch me that officer from the hall and something flat." I fetched both. 5 minutes later, the grille was off. Behind it ran a narrow duct, broader than needed for air, and crooked in a way that had nothing to do with heating. Mercer shone the flashlight in. Dust old wood, a dropped button, and farther in a branching opening that seemed to angle toward the rear library. A listening duct, I said, or service access for wiring, later adapted either way it carries sound. She straightened. Stand in the library and talk. I went through the rear door, crossed into the smaller room, and took position by the shelf opposite. Like this. Louder. Lieutenant Rowcliffe is a flower. Mercer's voice came back at once. Better, I returned, she said. Someone standing here could hear voices in the library. Someone in the library might hear this room, if the house were quiet. That doesn't open the lock. No, she said, but it opens the performance. Which was Mercer all over. She preferred people to mechanics. Not because mechanics were dull, but because people arranged them. The knife was bagged and taken away for prints. There were some, naturally, Gideon's one servants, and a partial not yet named, that would keep Rowcliffe cheerful for an hour. Mercer moved on to the floor. The rug before the desk had been rolled back. Beneath it was parquet, worn in old patterns. Near the desk chair there were scuffs from shoes, one shallow groove, and a faint black mark, where something small and metallic had scraped or dropped. Mercer got on one knee and studied it the way Wolfe studies a sentence he disapproves of. That wasn't made by the knife, she said. Then what? Something with a squared edge. Maybe a key, maybe a clasp, maybe a shoe plate. Not enough yet. She moved farther toward the hearth, then stopped. Here. I came over, along one seam in the floor, where the boards met close to the paneling. There was a line of dark grit that didn't match the rest of the room's respectable dust. Coal, I said. Not from the great, old cellar soot, perhaps, and it's been pressed up, not settled down. That sounded odd enough to deserve checking. Mercer had the rugs moved fully and began tapping the floorboards with the handle of her flashlight. At one point, the tone changed barely, but enough. Hollow underneath. The officer in the hall was sent for a carpenter's pry bar, to his disgust and Mercer's indifference. The board came up reluctantly, splintering at one nail. Under it there was not a tunnel, not a melodramatic stair, but a shallow crawl space between joists, black with old dust and smelling of dry rot and ash. Something had been pushed there once and dragged out more than once. We found a length of frayed blanket, the rusted stub of a candle tin, and a small wooden bead. Mercer held the bead in her palm. Child's toy, or curtain trim, number smoothed by fingers. She peered into the space again. This doesn't connect far. It's not a route, it's storage, or concealment. Concealment for what? She looked at me. Start with a child. That sat between us. By then the study's locked. Room dignity had a crack in it. Not because we had found a murderer's passage in the wall, because we had found that the room had a history of secret use. Once a room admits one hidden function, you stop trusting all its others, Mercer said. Cellar. We went down by the rear service stairs with Kelm protesting mildly, a patrolman carrying the flashlight, and one of the housemaids making the sign of the cross behind us when she thought no one could see. The cellar of Ashcroft House was stone, walled, dry and sprawling. Coal bins no longer in service, wine storage, boiler space, shelves for preserves, and locked rooms whose purpose had died with 3 generations of private staff. Servants had used it all their lives and knew nothing, which is common in large houses. People often know the route to the laundry and not the truth under their feet. At the far end, beyond a disused storage room with broken garden furniture, Mercer stopped before a narrow door almost hidden by old shelving. The knob was newer than the jamb. The lower panel bore scratches on the inside. Key? She asked. No one had one. The door was forced. Inside was a small, windowless chamber, perhaps 8 feet by 10, with whitewashed walls, now gone yellow, a cot frame without mattress, a sink, 2 shelves, and a vent near the ceiling. No furniture fit for comfort, no decoration, no reason for existence that could be spoken aloud at a dinner table. Kelm stared. I never knew of this, Mercer said. That does not flatter you as much as you think. On the lower shelf lay old newspapers, a cracked mug, and 3 books swollen by damp. One was a school grammar, one, Plutarch in a cheap edition. The third was a child's atlas, front cover missing. On the inside page, in faded pencil, was written RV. I admit that got me. Mercer took the atlas and turned pages carefully. In the margin of a map of South America, someone had drawn a ship and written go. The scratches on the inside of the door were small, close set, not made by a grown man's ring or careless boot. On the floor beside the cot were wax drippings. Under the sink, a tin box held 2 marbles, a stub pencil, and a strip of paper with a copied line in a boy's hand. "A house is a place where they know where you are." Mercer read it and said nothing. That was unusual enough to matter. At length she turned to Kelm. "How old is this room? Who would?" He shook his head helplessly. "Perhaps Partridge, or one of the older servants once." "Bring Partridge." The butler came down after some delay, as if cellars were beneath his principles. He entered the chamber, saw the cot, the shelf, the atlas in Mercer's hand. And for the first time since I had met him, his face actually altered. "You knew," Mercer said. After a silence, he answered, "Yes, madam." "For what was it used?" He swallowed. "When Master Rowan was a boy, he was sometimes kept below." "No one spoke," Mercer said. "Kept below." Partridge's voice had gone thinner, only for hours. When he was unmanageable, Mr. Gideon believed quiet and separation would improve his temper. By locking him in a cellar room. "Yes, madam." "At what age?" "From perhaps 10, not often, less later." "Who attended him?" "Usually I carried meals, sometimes Mrs. Bell, the nurse, while she remained in service." I said, "Did the house know?" "Servants know what a house requires them not to mention." Mercer held up the atlas. "This was Rowan's." "Yes, madam." So the missing heir was not merely strictured, corrected, and privately tutored. He was hidden inside his own house. Partridge closed his eyes once. Mr. Gideon said, "The boy must not be encouraged in displays." "Displays?" "Passions, madam. Defiance, running off, unseemly speech." Mercer's tone stayed level, which made it hit harder. "So when the child displeased him, Gideon put him in a locked room underground." Partridge did not answer, which was answer enough. I looked around that little chamber with its cot frame, scratched door, and shelf of cast-off reading, and suddenly the preserved chair upstairs became less like sentiment and more like penitence badly disguised. A man who locks a son in a cellar and then keeps his place at table empty for 22 years, not honoring memory. He is negotiating with it. Mercer turned to me as we came back into the passage. "The study was never impossible," she said, "only decorated." "You think this explains the murder?" "It explains the climate." She tucked the atlas under her arm. "And climate tells you what kinds of lies grow." Back upstairs, she returned to the study and stood in the center of it while sunlight, already going gold, touched the paneling and made the room look once again dignified, expensive, and self-contained. But it had lost the trick. I knew about the listening duct. She knew about the hollow floor. And under the house, in a room no guest had ever seen, there remained the marks of a child, once hidden like disgrace. "That's why the locked room cracked," she said. "How?" "Because now I know the house was built around cruelty. Once that is true, secret access, staged appearances, manipulated sounds, and arranged evidence stop being unlikely. They become family grammar." She looked at the quiet window, the locked latch, the desk where Gideon had died, and the space opposite where Reed had last stood. The person who killed Gideon didn't need magic, just knowledge of the room, of the house, and of what frightened him most. I nodded, because the cellar had done more than expose old cruelty. It had taken the grandeur out of the mystery. Rich rooms always want to look inevitable. But once you find the hidden vent, the lifted board, the child's bead under the floor, and the locked chamber where a son had once been put away, elegance loses its authority. Ashcroft House had not merely hidden a murderer, it had practiced for him. Chapter 6. The lie in the will money entered the case at 5:15, which is to say it entered precisely on time. Until then, Ashcroft House had given us fear, concealment, memory, and one dead tyrant. Those are respectable motives, but they do not satisfy a detective for long because they spread too evenly. Money narrows things. It may not improve human conduct, but it improves arithmetic. Detective Ruth Mercer found it in a red leather dispatch case hidden not in Gideon Vale's safe, where a man keeps documents he trusts, but in the locked right drawer of the desk in the study, where a man keeps papers he intends to use before someone else sees them. Julian Kelm produced the key with the expression of a secretary, surrendering not merely metal but a portion of his soul. Inside the case were 2 sealed envelopes, a memorandum in Gideon's hand, and a draft will dated 12 days earlier. Mercer read it standing by the desk lamp. I watched her face and got enough from that to know the room had just changed shape again. Then she handed it to me. Gideon Vale's previous will, as Kelm reluctantly explained, had been simple enough. The house, the principal business holdings, and the controlling power over several family trusts remained under a consolidated estate structure, with life provisions to certain dependents and executive authority passing to a named committee until various distributions matured. That was the public-looking version. The draft in my hand was the private correction. If Rowan Vale were proved alive, his legal position changed at once from decorative ghost to principal heir. That by itself would have been disturbance enough. But the document went further. Gideon had added a codicil dismantling an arrangement that had benefited 3 very living people. The first was Maribel. She was not, as I had first assumed from the old cellar room, the long-gone nurse herself, that had been Mrs. Bell, dead these 8 years. Maribel was her daughter, now in her late 30s, employed at Ashcroft House for the past 6 years in the vague but useful capacity. Rich houses often invent for old loyalties. Companion, household aid, custodian of drawers and tempers. She was handsome in a grave, dark way, with a controlled face and the sort of quiet that makes men underestimate women until documents appear. The second was Simon Vale, Gideon's younger cousin, and until this unpleasant week, acting manager of one cluster of family investments housed under the Vale Development Corporation. I had not met him because he had been in Philadelphia on business when Gideon died. But he was expected back that evening, which suddenly mattered more than before. The draft will sharply reduced his discretionary authority and required full trust review upon any verified claim regarding Rowan. The third was Jonah Rusk, Gideon's attorney. Rusk had prepared the prior estate papers, supervised the trust amendments of 19 years earlier, and if Gideon's new memorandum was to be believed, had lately become evasive on matters previously settled. In plain English, Gideon had begun to suspect his own lawyer of helping preserve a convenient legal fog. Mercer said, "Now we have a machine." I said, "And somebody had been getting paid to oil it." Kelm, who had gone from grey to chalky, said sharply, "That is a reckless statement." Mercer turned to him. "Then let's make it careful. Explain why the absence of Rowan Vale produced a structure in which Miss Bell receives continued security payments. Simon Vale retains practical control over trust authority, and Jonah Rusk preserves confidentiality over the original record set." Kelm licked his lips. The arrangements were established because Rowan was presumed dead, but not legally declared so. There had to be contingencies. "Yes," Mercer said, "contingencies that became profitable." He winced. That was as close as he would come to agreement. The memorandum in Gideon's hand was brief and ugly. He had written it the way men do when they have finally begun to distrust what they themselves signed years earlier. One line said, if Rowan lived beyond his majority, several transfers were improper. Another, Rusk claims original schedule lost, not credible. And a third, more telling than both, Simon has been too calm for years. Mercer read that aloud once and then looked at me. "There's your power motive." "And Mara?" I asked. She tapped the margin of the draft will. Gideon intended to terminate a private annuity to Maribel and convert it into a one-time settlement. Why would that matter enough to mention unless the annuity was serving some older purpose? We got that answer within the hour. Marabelle was brought to the morning room by a maid who looked apologetic, as if summoning a household employee into the center of a family scandal violated the silver. Mara entered with her head level and her hands quiet. She wore a dark blue dress, no jewelry but a watch, and the expression of a woman who had spent years inside other people's messes and had no intention of drowning in this one. Mercer did not waste time. "Miss Bell, your mother was Rowan Vale's nurse." "Yes." "You grew up partly in this house." "Yes." "You currently receive a private annuity under Gideon Vale's authority." A pause. "I do." "Why?" "My mother served the family faithfully." Mercer nodded. "That's the sort of sentence people use when the real reason has nails in it." "Try again." Mara's gaze flicked to me, then back. "After my mother died, Mr. Vale chose to continue assistance. Out of gratitude, perhaps." Mercer set Gideon's memorandum on the table, but not close enough for Mara to read. Did the assistance relate to Rowan? That hit. Not visibly for most people, perhaps, but enough for Mercer and me. Mara's shoulders did not move. Her eyes did. Once, she said, everything in this house related to Rowan, even when his name was forbidden. "That is not an answer." "No," Mara said. "It is a warning." Mercer leaned back. "Good. I like those. Give me the useful part." Mara looked toward the windows. "My mother believed the boy had been wronged. That is too general. She believed he had been hidden, bullied, and written around. She kept copies of things, notes, schedules, medication slips. She said that if Mr. Gideon ever decided to erase Rowan entirely, papers would matter." Kelm made a strangled sound. "Copies of household records." Mara turned on him with sudden heat. "Yes, Mr. Kelm, some of us learned that memory alone does not survive rich men." "That improved the room?" Mercer asked. "Did Gideon know?" "In time. He paid my mother to remain quiet after Rowan vanished, not with a bribe exactly, with provision. Later he paid me, not because I had threatened him, because he preferred not to wonder how much I knew. There it was, not loyalty, management." "Where are the copies?" Mercer asked. Mara hesitated. "Not here. Safe. For now. Did Gideon know where? Numbered. Did anyone else?" A smaller pause. Jonah Rusk suspected. Mercer's eyes narrowed. Because he once tried to persuade my mother to surrender all unofficial materials for legal safekeeping." She laughed in his face. "That made me like the late Mrs. Bell," Mercer said. "Why did Gideon cut your annuity in the new draft?" Mara answered at once. "Because he had begun to think Rowan might truly be alive, and once that happened all his old hush arrangements became dangerous." "That had the ring of solid metal, and Simon Vale?" Mercer asked. Mara's mouth thinned. "Simon never cared whether Rowan was alive, only whether Rowan remained unusable. Meaning, missing men cannot sign, cannot contest, cannot inherit actively. They are very convenient to cousins who enjoy managing things." At 6 o'clock, Simon Vale arrived from Philadelphia. He was 50, perhaps, smooth-faced, elegant, and so perfectly barbered he looked as if each feature had been reviewed by counsel. He was not large, not loud, not visibly greedy. Men like that can be more dangerous than brutes because they know the value of appearing temperate while standing beside the vault. He received news of Gideon's death with formal gravity, news of the will with sharper gravity, and news of Elias Reed with none at all. That last point interested Mercer. "You're not surprised," she said. "I am too old to be surprised by Vale family nonsense," Simon replied. "Yet Gideon's draft will remove your authority over the Halcyon and East River trusts if Rowan is verified alive. That would be awkward. Yes. You don't seem offended." He gave a thin smile. "Detective, offense is for people without accountants," Mercer said. "Did you know Gideon was revising the will?" Numbered did Jonah Rusk. "I assume lawyers know everything they pretend not to. Did you ever see records in the name Rowan Vane?" That touched him, a fraction, but enough. "Number, you thought before answering." "I always think before answering. That must cost time." He looked at her and decided against charm. My cousin indulged sentimental absurdities about his son. The estate had to function regardless. Missing heirs do not improve administration, neither do murders, Mercer said. He spread a hand. Surely you are not suggesting I traveled from Philadelphia to stab Gideon over paperwork? No, Mercer said. I'm suggesting the paperwork may tell me who wanted Gideon silent before he signed. That shut him. Jonah Rusk came later and disliked every minute of it. He was past 60, dry as paper, with rimmed spectacles and the odor of a man who believes confidentiality should protect him from weather. He objected to the reading of draft documents, to implied accusations, to the seizure of files, and to Mercer's tone. Mercer improved none of these conditions. You handled the trust amendments 19 years ago, she said. Continued absence. Useful distinction. It is a legal one. Legal for whom? For the estate. Which estate? He blinked. That happens when lawyers are asked to identify the beneficiary of their abstractions. Mercer stepped in. Because from where I stand, Mr. Rusk, the estate was a machine built on silence and delay. Rowan absent, Gideon powerful, Simon managerial, Mara paid to stay quiet, and you in possession of the seals. Rusk drew himself up. That is outrageous. Good, Mercer said. Outrage loosens people. Why was the original schedule of beneficiaries missing? It was not missing, it was superseded. By whom? By Mr. Vale's authority. On what showing? Rusk hesitated. And there it was again, the little legal pause where memory meets liability. I said, That's a charming silence, Counselor. He ignored me. Mercer did not. Did Gideon ever produce proof that Rowan was dead? She asked. Number. Then how did you justify the structure? Because there had been no contact for years, and because the needs of management required continuity. Management, Mercer said, is often the polite word for theft deferred. Rusk reddened. By 7 we had enough to see the outline. Rowan's disappearance had not merely grieved the family. It had lubricated a system. So long as the son remained absent but not conclusively dead, money could be held, authority extended, inconvenient witnesses pensioned, and records revised under the banner of necessity. It was not inheritance in the ordinary sense. It was a machine built to profit from uncertainty, and then Gideon, old and frightened, and perhaps finally guilty enough to act, had drafted a will that threatened to break it. If Rowan were proved alive, or if someone convincing enough could force the question, distributions changed, powers collapsed, and old paper might have to be shown daylight. Mercer stood in the study with the will in one hand and Gideon's memorandum in the other. This murder isn't only about shame, she said. It's about who needed the dead to stay missing. I nodded. Because fear may begin the story, but profit keeps it neat. And in Ashcroft House, neatness had been expensive for a very long time. Chapter 7. The woman who heard the toast crack by 8 that evening, Ashcroft House had entered the phase of a murder inquiry, when everyone was tired enough to tell the truth badly. That does not mean they tell it all. It means the Polish slips. Sentences arrive with edges on them. People who have spent years arranging themselves for survival forget. Now and then, which version they are performing. Detective Ruth Mercer knew it and used it. She had them moved less, watched them more, and asked her best questions when the house had grown too weary to brace. Marabelle was in the small sitting room off the library when Mercer sent for her again. A lamp had been lit. The long windows were black mirrors now, and somewhere below stairs a servant dropped a tray and was immediately hushed by the whole institution. Mara was seated straight, backed on a narrow sofa, hands folded, as if posture might still defend her. It didn't. I was there because Mercer had stopped objecting to my presence and had perhaps begun to find it useful. That was not flattery. A second pair of ears is handy when the first pair belongs to a detective who distrusts silence less than speech. Mercer closed the door and took the chair opposite Mara. I remained near the mantel. The room smelled faintly of furniture polish, and the coffee no one had finished. You were in the dining room last night, Mercer said. Yes. You stood behind Miss Honora until the soup was served. Mara's brows lifted a little. You notice house staff now. I notice anyone who hears before the rest of us. Mercer folded one leg over the other. You heard something at dinner. Mara was still a moment. What sort of something? The moment Gideon saw Elias Reed in Rowan's chair, everyone else saw offense. You heard panic. That landed. Mara looked down once at her hands, then back up. Yes. Describe it. She took a breath. His voice did not alter at first. That was the strangest part. Mr. Gideon could be furious and make it sound like table manners, but once or twice, over the years, something would get under the control. Not loudness, not stammering, a dryness, as if each word had to pass over sand last night. When he said, "Let us sit," that dryness was there. You had heard it before? Yes. When? Mara hesitated. Mercer let the pause stand. At the arrival of certain letters, Mara said at last. Once when my mother mentioned Rowan's name after too many years had gone by. Once when Mr. Rusk told him a record had been requested from Boston. And once, she stopped. And once, Mercer said. Mara's mouth thinned. When he was told someone had been seen outside the house asking old servants questions. That someone being Elias Reed, I assumed so. Mercer nodded. So the letters frightened him. Yes. Enough to make him confess? Mara gave a short, humorless laugh. Mr. Gideon did not confess. He revised the lighting. That was good enough to be true, I said, meaning he managed appearances instead. She looked at me, meaning he would sooner stage a revelation than submit to one. Mercer leaned forward a little. Then why seat Reed in Rowan's chair? That was not management. That was exposure. No, Mara said quietly. It was theatre. To what end? To see who knew what. To watch faces. To force someone else to break first. Mercer watched her. You're certain? Yes. Because you knew him so well. Mercer said. Beside him in what sense? In the sense, a woman may exist in a house owned by a man who pays her, questions her, mistrusts her, and keeps her because dismissing her would be more dangerous than tolerating her. Did he threaten you? Not with blows. Mr. Gideon disliked vulgarity. He preferred dependence. That was better than an affidavit, I said, and you remained. Mara turned her head to me. Where should I have gone? My mother was dead. He controlled the income. He called generosity. Every year he reminded me that loyalty was being rewarded and could be differently remembered. Rich men are often too civilized to say, I own you. They merely make alternatives expensive. Mercer did not interrupt. She had the knack of recognizing when a witness had stopped reciting and begun to remember. Mara continued. He trusted no one fully. Not Simon, not Mr. Rusk, not Mr. Kelm, not Miss Honora, certainly not me, but he trusted habit. That is why houses like this survive. Everybody keeps performing the same arrangement because the arrangement is older than courage. I thought of the cellar room and said nothing. Mercer asked, when the letters came, how did he behave? He stopped sleeping properly. He changed the order of the mail twice. He asked for old account books from storage and then denied having done so. He began locking drawers he had never locked before. Once I entered the study with coffee and found him reading one of Rowan's old letters. He put it in the fire before I reached the desk. Did you read any of the threatening letters? Only one. He left it face up for perhaps 10 seconds, it said. The place remembers what the father did. Mercer's eyes stayed on her. And what had the father done? Mara was silent, I said. We found the cellar room. That hit harder than anything yet. Her gaze flicked to me, then away. Then the house has become candid at last. You knew about it, Mercer said. Yes. Did Rowan spend time there? Yes. How often? Enough. Under whose orders? Mr. Gideon's. For discipline. Mara let out breath through her nose. That was the word used upstairs, Mercer said. And downstairs. Mara met her eyes. Punishment, concealment, correction, choose whichever hurts you least. Mercer nodded once. You see, that is the tone I have been waiting for. Stay with it. What did Gideon fear Reed would expose? Not merely that Rowan might be alive. Mara's voice had gone flatter now, as if the feelings had burned off and left only grain. He feared that if Rowan had lived long enough, spoken enough, written enough, then the story Gideon told about him might not survive inspection. What story? That Rowan was unstable, ungrateful, impossible to manage, a son who disgraced himself and fled. That was the version easiest to preserve. And the harder version? Mercer asked. Mara looked toward the dark window. That he was a boy who learned too early that love in this house was conditional. Privacy meant secrecy, and obedience could put you in a locked room. For a moment no one spoke. Then Mercer said, "Did Gideon ever tell you he believed Reed might truly be Rowan?" "Number." "He told me once after the second letter. There are likenesses that are accidents and likenesses that are debts." I did not know which he meant. That was a fine sentence, and a poisonous one. I said, "Did he ever mention the shoulder scar?" Mara blinked. "Yes. Once, years ago, Rowan fell from the stone wall in the rear garden and split the skin badly. Mr. Gideon raged at the boy for bleeding on his jacket before he summoned the doctor. He remembered the scar because it made him ashamed, and he hated shame." Mercer said, "So if Reed bore such a scar, Gideon would hear more than resemblance. He would hear accusation." "Yes," Mercer shifted. "At dinner, after Reed sat, what else did you notice?" Mara answered slowly, reconstructing it. Mr. Gideon held his wineglass by the stem too tightly. He did not drink until the fish course. He looked once toward Mr. Kelm, and once toward Mr. Rusk's empty place at the sideboard cabinet, as if expecting the lawyer to materialize out of crystal. When Peter spoke rashly, Mr. Gideon was almost grateful. It gave him a script. But when Dr. Sloane asked directly about Mr. Reed, there was a moment. She stopped and pressed her fingers together. There was a moment when Mr. Gideon looked not angry but cornered. "Because Sloane knew something?" Mercer asked. "I don't know." That was not a clean answer, Mercer said. Number Mara gave her a tired glance. "You wanted one?" Mercer almost smiled. "Not in this house." I had been watching Mara for 10 minutes and was not sure whether she knew more than she admitted or less than she believed. Mercer was ahead of me. "You keep doing two things," Mercer said. "You speak as if you were close enough to Gideon to read his breath. Then you retreat into uncertainty the moment another person enters the picture. Kelm, Sloane, Simon, Rusk, which is it? Do you know the lines of the play or only Gideon's part?" Mara looked at her for a long second. "Both less and more than you think." "That's elegant. Unpack it." "I knew Gideon's habits, moods, cruelties, and evasions because I lived under them. I did not know what bargains the men around him made in locked offices, because those bargains were made among men who called themselves practical. So yes, I know more than I say about his fear, and less than I pretend about the machinery around it." Mercer nodded. "Better." She rose, crossed to the side table, and poured water from a cut, glass carafe into a tumbler. She handed it to Mara, who accepted it after a second's hesitation. "Did you care for him?" Mercer asked. That one surprised me, and Mara too. She stared at the glass. "What a question!" "It matters." "Why?" "Because grief distorts memory, so does hatred. I'm trying to learn which one is performing in you." Mara took a sip. "Both, perhaps, or neither. I pitied him sometimes. That was dangerous. He could smell pity and punish it. I feared him often. I depended on him always, and near the end, she looked down into the water as if something might be written there. Near the end, I think he was afraid of me because I had seen him frightened." "That was excellent," I said. Even grief had become performance here. Mara turned to me. "No, Mr. Goodwin. Performance came first. Grief had to dress itself in whatever costumes were left." Mercer took that in and let it stay. A knock came at the door. Kelm put his head in and said that Simon Vale wished to know whether this domestic inquest would continue much longer. Mercer told him yes, and if Simon objected he could begin his objection in writing. Kelm withdrew. Mara gave a faint breath that might once have been amusement. "There, you see controlled appearances," Mercer said. "Yes, and cracks in them." She set the tumbler down. "Last question for now. Did Gideon intend to reveal something after dinner?" Mara considered. "I think he intended to threaten revelation, which is not the same. Would he have gone through with it?" Number. "Why not?" "Because truth in that house was useful only when kept in portions." Mercer looked at her for a beat. "That may be the best explanation of Ashcroft House I'll ever get." When Mara had gone, Mercer remained standing by the chair she had occupied. "She knows more than she says," I told her. "Yes," Mercer said, "and less than she pretends." I noticed that too. She reads Gideon perfectly, and everyone else by weather. That makes her valuable but not complete. I looked toward the hall, where somewhere Simon Vale was being offended. Kelm was folding papers into nervous stacks, and Miss Honora was probably preserving the family with her chin. "You think Mara heard the case turn before the rest of us did?" "She heard Gideon break," Mercer said. "Not openly, internally. That matters." She moved to the window and stood with her hands in her pockets, looking at the dark garden where Rowan had once fallen and bled on the wrong jacket. "Last night, the toast cracked before the glass did. Everyone heard the sound afterward. Mara heard it at once." I nodded, because in houses built on control, the first fracture is rarely loud. It is a change in tone, a dry note in the voice, a hand too tight on a stem, a woman who has lived under a man's moods, recognizing the exact instant fear enters the room. After that, everything else is only furniture giving way. Chapter 8. Ashes in the cellar. The drawing room of Ashcroft House had good chairs, old silver, and the kind of silence that costs money to maintain. The cellar had none of those advantages, which was probably why it had told us more truth. Detective Ruth Mercer went back down there at 9:30 that night with a flashlight, a police photographer, one patient patrolman and me. Lieutenant Rowcliffe was upstairs, enjoying the company of Jonah Rusk, which I took for a charitable arrangement in opposite directions. Mercer preferred the cellar. So did I. Drawing rooms in houses like that are designed to reassure. Cellars, if given time, develop honesty. The hidden room where Rowan had once been kept had already changed the case. No one could now pretend that the vanished son had merely quarreled, dramatized himself, and gone off into the fog. A boy locked below stairs ceases to be family legend and becomes evidence. But Mercer was not finished with the place. She had the instinct valuable in detectives and dangerous in husbands, that a lie repeated for years usually requires more than one storage compartment. The corridor smelled of stone, old coal, and dust disturbed by our earlier visit. The whitewashed chamber with the cot frame and the child's atlas looked worse under stronger light. That is often the way with rooms once used for cruelty. Distance gives them form, light gives them intention. Mercer stood in the doorway and turned slowly. "Not a punishment room only," she said. "You think he lived here? Not full time, but longer than ours." She nodded toward the shelf. "No one stocks Plutarch for temporary discipline." That was sound. On the shelf, besides the grammar, atlas, and cheap lives, we found 2 more books, wedged flat against the wall, as if someone had preferred them hidden from inspection. One was a volume of adventure stories with pages missing. The other was a notebook. Mercer opened it carefully. Most of the pages were blank or filled with copied lines in a boy's hand, neat at first and later slanting toward impatience. Latin verbs, dates, lists of ships, fragments of maps, then sentences. Not diary entries exactly. Notes, observations made by someone young enough to need secrecy and old enough to understand it. Mother would have hated this room. Aunt H knows and calls it rest. Peep says, "Don't shout, or it lasts longer. The house has ears in the walls. When visitors come, I go below." That last one sat in the center of the page, as if it had been written with special force. I said, "There's your respectability." Mercer nodded once, and turned more pages. Sometimes he is kind after. That is worst. If I am good at supper, they say, I am improved. Father does not like witnesses. Mara left me peach slices and was slapped for it. That brought Maribel closer to the child than she had admitted. Mercer saw it too, but said nothing yet. At the back of the notebook were entries written in a hand growing older and angrier. I am to be absent again on Thursday because the Branshaws come. They say I make scenes. Perhaps houses do. The room is not underground when the door is shut in your head. Mercer closed the notebook and handed it to the photographer after marking the pages. He wasn't hidden only for discipline, she said. He was hidden for display management. Meaning Gideon wanted a son in theory, and not in company. Meaning Rowan was produced when he reflected well and removed when he didn't. That was cruel enough and probably accurate. We searched beyond the little chamber. There were 2 larger storage rooms, one holding trunks and broken cases, the other old household ledgers, curtain poles, obsolete lamps, and enough cracked china to outfit a nervous museum. Mercer had the trunks opened one by one. Most contained what trunks contain when rich families forget them: moth-eaten uniforms, dead hats, useless linen, and the biographies of no one anyone would want revived. But one, in the far corner under a canvas dust sheet, held children's clothes, not baby things. Older, shirts, stockings, a winter coat, 2 pairs of shoes, and 3 jackets, all good quality, all outgrown long ago, and all marked inside the collar with the initials RV. Why keep them here? I asked. Mercer touched one cuff. Because someone did not want them upstairs. The winter coat had a tear at the left shoulder, clumsily mended from inside. On the lining near it, darkened by age, was a patch where blood had once soaked through. The wall fall, I said. Maybe. Mercer looked thoughtful. Or another injury preserved by accident. At the bottom of the trunk lay a small leather case. Inside were school exercise papers and 3 folded notes tied with string. The first, in a woman's hand, I guessed to be the dead nurse, Mrs. Bell, said he, must not be put below all afternoon again. He had no dinner yesterday and shook at night. The second, Mr. G, says no visitors are to see the boy. He is to remain out of sight until Sunday. The third was shorter. If this continues, I shall write to his aunt directly. No signature, no date, no proof it had ever been sent. Mercer handed them to me one at a time, and I did not much enjoy it. Servant testimony in ink, I said. Yes, and not just one incident. Her mouth tightened. A system. We found more in the ledgers. Old household account books had been shoved onto the bottom shelf in no order that meant anything now. But one book from the year Rowan was 14 had notations in a side hand against certain meal entries, sent below tray to lower room. No dessert for YG. The initials beside these notations were P. And Partridge later admitted, with visible strain, that they were his. You kept the record, Mercer said when he was shown the ledger. Partridge stood in the cellar passage with his gloves folded in front of him, looking as if the whole house had at last turned and asked him to account for the wallpaper. Only for provisioning, madam, not for conscience. He did not answer, Mercer said. When visitors came, was Rowan often sent below? Partridge took a breath. Yes, madam. How often? Whenever Mr. Gideon judged the boy unfit to appear. Unfit meaning angry, sometimes, or untidy. Yes, madam. Or likely to speak freely. Partridge's eyes flicked once toward the hidden room. Yes, madam, there it was. Not merely shame, control of the social narrative. Miss Honora came down at 10, which surprised me. I had not thought she would willingly visit the underworld of her brother's reputation. But perhaps there are moments when a woman who has spent 20 years defending a family decides it is better to inspect the damage herself. She entered the storage room, saw the children's trunk open, the notebooks bagged, the ledger on the packing crate, and stopped, not theatrically, not with a cry. Just stopped as if her body had found a fact too heavy to carry, without warning. Mercer faced her. You knew he was put below. I knew it happened. How often? I did not count. Did you object? A pause. Yes. And? Gideon said I sentimentalized weakness. That sounded plausible enough to have been repeated. Mercer gestured toward the hidden room. Why not remove the boy, send him to school, openly, to relatives, anywhere? Honora looked at the cot frame. Because Gideon wanted him near. That sat with us. Near and unnamed, Mercer said, yes. Why? Honora's chin rose, then lowered again, which in her was the equivalent of collapse, because absence under one roof was easier for Gideon than contradiction under another. I said. He wanted to possess the son without enduring him. She turned her head and looked at me with tired hostility. You say it as if you invented fathers. Number just this one. Mercer did not let the pause soften. Was Rowan ill? Honora frowned. Not in the way Gideon implied. Sensitive, yes, quick-tempered, yes, clever beyond prudence. He could be wild with rage and then devastated by having shown it. Gideon made of that a defect requiring management. I thought it grief, loneliness, and a household built to suffocate anyone who spoke directly. That was the cleanest thing I had ever heard her say. Why preserve the chair, then? Mercer asked. Honora closed her eyes once. Because Gideon was vain enough to turn guilt into ritual. No one improved that sentence. From the second storage room came a call from the patrolman we joined him. He had opened a long packing crate behind old curtain rods and found a stack of framed portraits wrapped in felt. Most were ancestral decorations. One was Rowan at about 17, painted from life perhaps. Not brilliantly, but accurately enough to matter. We set it against the wall under the flashlight beam. That changed things. Photographs can flatten, or lie by stillness. A portrait sometimes preserves the trouble better. Rowan in the painting was thin, dark, restless even at rest. With one hand thrust into a jacket pocket, as if to keep it from doing something indiscreet. The line of cheek and brow was there. So was a certain guarded amusement around the mouth. Not Elias Reed exactly, but enough of him that Gideon, startled by age lighting fear and memory, could have felt his inside break. Miss Honora stared at the portrait. I had forgotten that one, Mercer said. Number you had buried it. Honora did not deny that either. Under the portrait in the crate lay a packet of servant memoranda tied with kitchen string. Most were dull. Guest arrangements, coal deliveries, linen complaints. 2 were not. The first from Partridge to Mrs. Bell. Read, MRG orders master not to be seen during the dinner for the Kelm party. Keep him below until all are gone. The second, unsigned but likely from the nurse. Read, this cannot continue. He is not a mad child, only a desperate one. Mercer took that one very gently. What happened later is still unclear, she said as if to herself. Why he finally left, who helped him, whether he returned in any fashion, whether Reed is connected by blood or by design. But one thing is no longer unclear. I nodded. Rowan wasn't lost. Number, she looked around the cellar, the trunks, the cot, the ledgers, the scraps of duty and avoidance. He was hidden. That altered every room upstairs. The drawing room where guests had admired silver while the boy sat below. The dining room where a chair was later preserved as if memory could excuse method. The study where Gideon had died among leather and locked windows. All of it shifted now under the pressure of one fact. The missing son had once been made absent deliberately, repeatedly, within the very house that later treated his disappearance as tragic mystery. Once that surfaced, everyone had reason to fear what came next. Mara Bell because her mother had kept records, and she had inherited more than money from them. Simon Vale because any proof that Rowan had been wrongfully managed, hidden, or perhaps deprived of his legal position, would rip open the estate machine. Jonah Rusk because legal convenience becomes conspiracy the moment a child stops being theoretical. Miss Honora because knowledge tolerated too long acquires its own guilt. Partridge because obedience written in ledgers is still obedience. Kelm because clerks who copy lies do not become innocent by neatness. Even Dr. Sloane, I thought. because a physician in a house like that is often asked to certify what others wish to call improvement. And somewhere in the middle of it stood Elias Reed, the man with the borrowed face, who may have been heir, impostor, or instrument, but who had already done one undeniable thing. He had made the house remember itself. Mercer picked up Rowan's notebook and the unsigned servant note, then looked once toward the ceiling as if seeing through 4 floors of respectable upholstery to the dinner table above. "The cellar has more truth than the drawing room," she said. "That's usually where they keep the fuel," I told her. She gave me half a glance that almost admitted amusement. In this house, they kept the sun there too. And that, unfortunately, was no figure of speech. Chapter 9. The hand behind the letter. By 11 that night, the case had stopped growing wider and begun, at last, to narrow. That is the pleasant theory. In practice, what happens is that half your suspects become worse. The other half become more interesting, and the person with the neatest story begins to smell faintly of glue. Detective Ruth Mercer had reached that stage. So had I. Ashcroft House was still full of motives, but not all motives had the same handwriting. The threatening letters had first looked like the voice of a returned son that had been the point. A place kept empty is still occupied. The house remembers what the family buries. He will sit where you left him. They had the right pressure on the old bruise. They spoke Rowan without naming him too plainly, and they drove Gideon Vale exactly where the writer wanted him. Into fear, secrecy, and theatrical mistakes. But by then Mercer no longer trusted their script, and neither did I. We were in the study again, with the desk lamp on, the rest of the room held low in shadow, and the letters spread in a row on blotting paper, while a police handwriting man grumbled over magnification and ink. Lieutenant Rowcliffe hovered on the edge of usefulness, which is his natural station. Kelm stood by the bookshelf, looking as if he hoped paper might suddenly become a private matter again. Elias Reed had been sent back under watch to his hotel. Simon Vale and Jonah Rusk had each given one more evasive statement and been allowed the poor comfort of temporary freedom. Mercer pointed with a pencil. Same machine, same paper stock, same pressure on the capitals, but not the same source material. Rowcliffe frowned. English. She tapped the first note. These are theatrical, but educated theatrical. The writer knows how the family myth sounds, not how Rowan sounded. I said, "You're saying somebody forged a ghost from second-hand legend?" "Yes," the handwriting man cleared his throat. "Typed, not handwritten. But there's one useful thing, the penciled addition on the last note. Trust the third ledger, not the first's, was written by a different hand from the block printing on the notes." Mercer nodded. "Exactly. Which means at least 2 minds touched the performance. One composed the warnings. Another, or the same person under stress, added the practical instruction later." Rowcliffe said, "Could be Reed." Mercer turned to him. "Could be you. I'm interested in what's likelier." That shut him for almost 10 seconds. The ledgers had helped. In the second-floor office where Kelm kept current household and estate abstracts, Mercer had found that one old accounts volume, the third ledger named in pencil, contained 2 entries crossed from the index in a way too neat to be accidental. One referred to a discretionary disbursement to Mrs. Bell in the year after Rowan vanished. The other referred to a cash transfer, authorized through Simon Vale, and marked by Jonah Rusk's initials. The sum was large enough to steady nerves and small enough to hide among property adjustments. "Silence money," I said. Kelm protested. "Contingency reserve." "Of course," I told him. "That's what silence is called after law school." Mercer had also tightened the timeline. That was where the room began to clear. The anonymous letters started 10 days before Gideon's death. Simon Vale had been in increasingly poor financial condition for at least 6 months, not ruined but strained. We got that from documents in Gideon's dispatch case and from Simon's face when Mercer asked about a margin loan attached to speculative river front holdings. A man need not be bankrupt to kill. He need only be pressed enough to fear inspection. Jonah Rusk had more to lose than money. If the trust structure collapsed under review, his legal superseding of the old schedules would look less like administration and more like concealment. Maribel stood to lose her annuity and perhaps the leverage of inherited papers. Kelm stood to lose position and reputation, but not, I thought, his sleep. He had been clerk enough for too long to graduate suddenly into blood. Honora Vale had knowledge and guilt, but not appetite. Dr. Sloane had proximity and perhaps old loyalties, but no visible profit. That left Simon and Rusk glowing a little brighter every hour. Mercer had Simon brought in again just before midnight. He entered the morning room immaculate and annoyed, which is often how bred desperation chooses to dress. She let him sit, then put before him not accusation first, but arithmetic. "These are your exposure notes," she said, laying down copies from Gideon's files. "These are the trust review provisions in Gideon's unsigned draft will, and this is the index entry showing a private transfer you authorized in the year after Rowan vanished." Simon glanced once and said, "I want counsel," Mercer said. "You have a lawyer. He wants distance. For the moment you have me instead." He smiled thinly. "Then I decline to educate you in estate law. I'm not asking law, I'm asking motive." She leaned forward. The letters shook Gideon. He pulled records. He summoned Reed. He drafted a will that cut your authority. That is a bad 10 days for you. It was a bad 10 days for everyone. "Yes," Mercer said. "But only one person in this house had both old knowledge and recent need." That got a flicker. "Not fear, calculation," Simon said. "If you mean I wrote melodramatic notes to my cousin and then stabbed him in his own study, you ought to be embarrassed. I will schedule it if evidence fails. Until then, answer this. When did you first hear of Elias Reed?" "At dinner." "You're lying." His eyes hardened. "Careful." "No," Mercer said. "You be careful, because Gideon's memorandum says Simon has been too calm for years. And Maribel says you only ever cared whether Rowan remained unusable. Men in your position dislike the sudden arrival of usable heirs, even counterfeit ones." He looked at her. A long second, and then chose partial truth, which is what intelligent men do when the whole is too expensive. "I heard of Reed 2 days before dinner," he said. "From whom?" "Rusk." "Why?" "Because Gideon had asked him whether any proof of identity could reopen the old structures. Rusk was alarmed enough to mention it." "That was useful and ugly," Mercer said. "Did you write the letters?" "Number," did Rusk. "Number, you answered too fast." "I answered because I know his style. Jonah threatens with procedure, not poetry." That was better than denial. It suggested familiarity with the method, if not the authorship. When Rusk was brought back and confronted with Simon's admission, he turned brittle. Lawyers do that when secrecy, once their profession, begins to look like personal shelter. "Yes," he said. Simon knew Reed had surfaced. Gideon asked legal questions. "That is not a crime." "No," Mercer said. "But obscuring the underlying records may be." "I obscured nothing." She put Rowan's old letter before him, the one that said, "A chair is cheaper than honesty." Then beside it, the recent note, "He will sit where you left him." Rusk looked from one to the other, and his mouth changed. Mercer saw it. So did I. "You've seen that phrase before," she said. He recovered too late. "It is generic. Number, it is borrowed." She tapped the old Rowan letter. "Who had access to Gideon's private packet?" Rusk said nothing. "Who knew enough of Rowan's language to imitate the ghost, but not enough to sound like the boy himself?" Still nothing. Kelm, standing at the edge of the room, suddenly spoke. "Mr. Rusk reviewed private family correspondence when preparing the trust amendments." Everyone turned to him. He looked sick and determined, which is a promising combination in secretaries. Rusk snapped. "That is privileged," Kelm said. "Privilege is not ownership." There was the clerk at last, discovering spine under stationery, Mercer said. So the letters were built from old source material, not written by Rowan, but assembled by someone who had read him, read Gideon's fears, and knew exactly which phrases would strike. Rusk's face had gone the color of envelope glue, but that still did not close the murder. It only showed the hand behind the letter might be legal, managerial, or both. Mercer wanted the rest, who wrote, who planned, who wielded the knife. It came from the timeline. Gideon met Reed privately before dinner. After dinner, he brought Reed into the rear library, spoke with him, and then delayed. Mara heard fear in him. Sloane heard enough to stay alert. Reed, waiting in the library, heard Gideon arguing with another man. Male voice, not identified. Simon claimed he was in Philadelphia until evening, but a garage receipt in Gideon's desk, found by one of Rowcliffe's men, and at last used intelligently, showed Simon's car had been admitted to a private lot 3 blocks away at 6:40. 8 that night. He had reached the house before dinner and entered by the side service way. Mercer put the receipt on the table and looked at him. Simon did not bother denying it at once. That was nearly as good as a confession. "I came to speak with Gideon," he said. "Privately," Mercer said. "Yes." "About Reed." "Yes." "About the will." Simon's silence admitted that too. "And after dinner?" she asked. I remained nearby. Gideon had become irrational. I wanted to know what he meant to do. "Nearby where?" "In the rear corridor." "So Reed heard your voice?" "Possibly." "Did Gideon accuse you?" Simon's jaw tightened. "He accused everyone." "Did he say the old arrangements were finished?" A longer pause. "Something like it." "Did he say Rowan had been wronged?" Simon looked at her with flat dislike. He said, if Rowan had lived and returned, certain men would answer for their ingenuity. Mercer nodded. "There it is." The room went quiet. "Did you kill him?" Rowcliffe demanded, "Because blunt instruments have their uses." "Number, then who did?" Simon turned his head slightly, not toward Rusk, not toward Kelm, but toward the door, toward the hall, toward the house itself. That was when Mercer did the best thing she had done all day. She stopped looking at the men and said, "Bring in Dr. Sloane." I admit it surprised me. Sloane entered calm, tired, and very nearly ready. Some people can carry composure so well that you forget it is luggage. Mercer did not forget. "You were in the study before the body was found," she said. "Yes." "You knew Gideon's voice under strain." "Yes." "You treated members of this family for years." "Yes." "You heard the letters discussed?" "Some." "You also knew Rowan as a boy?" Sloane's eyes shifted once. "Yes." Mercer laid Rowan's notebook on the table, open to the line. "The house has ears in the walls." "You knew about the cellar room. It was not a question," he said, after a pause. "Yes." "Did you object?" "I was young." Gideon called it corrective isolation. I objected more weakly than I should have. There it was, guilt with a diploma. Mercer kept going. "And when Gideon revived the old machinery with Reed, when he staged the chair, summoned the ghost, and prepared another manipulation, you concluded he would never confess cleanly, only rearrange the terms again." Sloane's face remained composed, but the composition had begun to crack. "I did not write the letters," he said. "But I knew Gideon was being pressed, and I did nothing to stop those who found that useful." "I know," Mercer replied. Rusk mined Rowan's old language. Simon benefited from the pressure. "But you, Doctor, you were the one man in that room who knew both the old wound and the new panic, and who could move without alarming Gideon." Rowcliffe stared. Simon stared. Even Rusk looked jarred out of himself. Mercer said, "The crime was written all over the house." "Yes, but the knife struck because the plan required several hands. One to compose the fear, one to profit from the confusion, and one finally to act when Gideon chose control over truth yet again." Sloane closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were older. "He would have destroyed it all again," he said quietly. "Not by confessing, by shaping another version. Reed was not Rowan. I knew that almost at once, but Gideon meant to use him. To frighten Honora, corner Simon, test Mara, and then build a new settlement in which he remained author of the story. Rowan wronged again, even in absence, Mercer said. "So you killed him." Sloane answered with the same weary plainness. "Yes." No one moved. In the study, Mercer said. Yes. With the paper knife? Yes. It was already on the desk, he said. It should have remained buried. I told him it had buried enough. He reached for the bell. I struck before he could ring again. Simon made a sound that might have been shock or disgust at finding murder more literal than finance, Mercer said. And the locked room impression. I left by the rear library after hearing movement in the drawing room. The windows were never used. The knife remained because I wanted the act seen as immediate, not prepared, which it was. He looked at the notebook on the table. Prepared by years, perhaps, not by that blade. That was true enough to be monstrous. Mercer nodded once. And the letters, Sloane said. I knew of them only in outline. Rusk wanted Gideon rattled. Simon wanted him pliable. I wanted him forced to face Rowan at last. We were not partners in murder. We were separate cowards with separate motives, all pushing the same old wound, until someone finally struck. That was one of the ugliest forms of truth. Not a single clean plot, but several selfish purposes aligning, until murder felt to one participant like justice. Mercer stood. The threatening letters were forged. Rowan's absence was used like a knife. Reed was made into accusation by design. Gideon was meant to be shaken, cornered, and maneuvered. But when the moment came, Doctor, you acted not in panic alone. No, Sloane said. In judgment? Yes. Rowcliffe moved then, because at last there was something he knew how to do. As he took Sloane into custody, the study seemed to change one final time, not simpler, merely legible. The weapon had struck in one room, but the crime had been written all over the house, in the cellar ledger, the hidden child, the pensioned silence, the altered will, the forged notes, the convenient absence, the men who profited, and the doctor who mistook long-delayed rage for moral authority. Mercer looked at the scattered papers and said quietly, This was built from old shame and recent desperation. Yes, I said. And that was the truth of it. Murder rarely springs from a single instant in houses like Ashcroft. It is drafted first, in money, in memory, in silence, in the stories one person tells and another person helps preserve. Only afterward does somebody pick up the knife. Chapter 10. The guest who Saturday in the wrong chair when I got back to West 35th Street. It was after 1 in the morning, and Nero Wolfe was where civilization expected him to be. In the office, in the big chair, with the lamp low, a book open, and the expression of a man who has not moved because movement had not yet been made worth the trouble. Fritz had left sandwiches. One had been eaten. That meant Wolfe had admitted the case to his metabolism. He looked up as I entered. Well, it's over, I said. He shut the book on a finger to keep the place. You say that too soon, too often. Not this time. Ruth Mercer got her confession. Dr. Adrian Sloane killed Gideon Vale. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. And the others. Useful in their various disagreeable ways, Simon Vale was in trouble and wanted Gideon frightened into compliance. Jonah Rusk mined old family material to build the anonymous letters. Mara Bell knew a great deal and carried some of it like an unpaid debt. Honora knew enough to be ashamed of not knowing more sooner. Elias Reed was exactly what he claimed to be, Elias Reed, and unlucky enough to resemble old Payne. Wolfe grunted. Sit down and tell it properly. So I did. I gave him the letters, the trust records, the cellar room, Rowan's notebook, the staged dinner, the revised will, Simon's financial strain, Rusk's legal fog, and Mercer's reconstruction of the final scene in the study. I told him about Sloane's confession, how the doctor had long known of Gideon's treatment of Rowan, how he had mistaken accumulated outrage for moral privilege, and how he had struck when Gideon showed every sign of using Reed not for truth, but for one more rearrangement. When I finished, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. That can mean reflection, indigestion, or contempt. With Wolfe there is overlap. At length, he said, it began with the chair. Yes. Not with the knife. Not with the letters. With the chair. That's what Mercer said too, in effect. She may have intelligence after all. He opened his eyes. The point is not merely that Reed sat in Rowan's place. The point is that Gideon placed him there. Yes. Wolfe lifted a finger. That act explains the whole structure. Gideon had received warnings evoking the missing son. He feared exposure, personal, legal, and moral. Reed appeared, not as proof, but as disturbance. Gideon's instinct was not confession. It was theater. He used the dinner as a test to see who broke first. Tupfui, of course. He seated Reed in the forbidden chair, because only someone inside the family's history would understand what that seat meant. He wished to observe shock, guilt, recognition, resentment. He made the past sit down among them. I nodded.